of the Budapest Memorandum. The world owes Ukraine its security. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky initiated a new format of negotiations to settle the security crisis created by Russia. 5 permanent members of the United Nations Security Council, plus Ukraine, Germany, and Turkey. This is the format that we are trying to convene. I reaffirm that Ukraine proposed some years ago to deploy a UN peacekeeping mission to Ukraine. Until now, United Nations Security Council has failed to take necessary decisions. Ukraine proposes to combine stark sanctions policy and strengthening of Ukraine together with keeping diplomatic channels open to persuade Russia to de-escalate and prioritize diplomacy. We urge member states to use all available means to protect Ukraine and deter Russia. Whatever action you can take is appreciated. We are grateful for the actions already taken by many of you. We expect the international community to do its best to put out the fire in the center of Europe, which is about to flare up. The Russian security crisis must end with Russia returning to the path of diplomacy. We call on all states and international organizations not to recognize any alteration of the status of the certain areas of the Donetsk and Lugansk regions of Ukraine, and to refrain from any action of dealing that might be interpreted as recognizing any such altered status. The absence of proper reaction or a neutral stance will only contribute to further escalation and sufferings. And, I regret to say it, it will not be limited to Ukraine's border and territory. On the contrary, active diplomacy, strong political messaging, tough economic sanctions, and strengthening Ukraine can still force Moscow to abandon aggressive plans. Swift and resolute actions by the United Nations can reclaim the organization's leading role at this historic and dark moment. Russia must withdraw its forces from the sovereign territory of Ukraine. Russia must stop destabilizing the international security situation. We Ukrainians want peace, and we want to resolve all issues through diplomacy. We stand ready for all possible scenarios and ready to protect our land and our people if Russia further attacks. Ukraine will not hesitate to exercise its inherent right of self-defense as outlined in Article 51 of the Charter of the United Nations in response to the armed attacks of the Russian Federation. These days, we have probably the last window of opportunity to do what Russia does not expect the United Nations and its member states to do. Demonstrate unprecedented ability and readiness to act in order to stop aggression. No matter what relations you develop among each other, it is your ultimate duty to defend the Charter of the United Nations. I thank you.
Okay, well, a very powerful speech by the Foreign Minister of Ukraine. We need to avert a new catastrophe in Europe that will affect everyone, he said. We are in the middle of the largest security crisis in Europe since the Second World War. Russia's claims are absurd, he said. We do not threaten anyone. We are not escalating anything. The only reason for building our defences are Russia's statements, and they are outrageous and horrific. Let's go and speak now to our US correspondent, Mark Stone. And Mark, a very powerful speech from the Ukrainians.
Yeah, very much so. You know, Mark, there is something about that chamber, isn't there? It sort of generates a focus that you don't necessarily get elsewhere. Had the foreign minister been speaking in Kiev or in another forum, perhaps the world's attention wouldn't be on it. I was just flicking through the different news channels, different countries, different languages. They're all sitting on that speech, and powerful words they were. We are at a critical juncture in world history, a catastrophe in Europe that no nation will be able to sit out. I mean, some might say this is hyperbole. I can tell you from people I'm speaking to behind the scenes here, they don't feel that it is. What's happening now, he said, must be a concern for all of you. He alluded to the fact that...
Mark, I'm just going to interrupt you for a moment. I think it is Lord Ahmed speaking. Is that right? Is it the British Foreign Office Minister speaking now? Can we just check that it is? Or we
has rebuffed offers of diplomacy and indeed discarded its international commitments. Commitments it has itself agreed and signed up to. Rather, it has pursued a campaign to withdraw Ukraine's internationally recognized borders by force. It is vital that we, the United Nations, the international community, must respond. We must understand the grave nature of where we are today. And together we must call on Russia to uphold the very founding principles of this, the United Nations, established precisely, as you said yourself, Mr. President, to end the scourge of war. Peace must prevail. We must highlight the human cost and respond to the humanitarian consequences of any further Russian military action. We know this will take a terrible toll on Ukrainians, but also it will take a toll on Russians alike, both victims of an unnecessary war of the Kremlin's choosing. And it's therefore essential that we must meet Russia's aggressive acts with solidarity, with strength, including through coordinated sanctions, to impose a severe cost on Russian interests and their economy. Yesterday, the United Kingdom announced new sanctions targeting billions of Russian assets. This is the largest sanctions package against Russia in British history, and it is part of our coordinated sanctions effort alongside our allies. But, Mr. President, we are clear that acting together with our allies, this is just the start. If Russia continues its campaign of aggression, we have a further package of sanctions ready to go. We urge the wider international community to join us in this effort. The Kremlin must understand the strength of the world's condemnation of President Putin's war of choice. Mr. President, let us pause for a moment. Let us reflect. This very week marks 8 years since Russia's illegal annexation of Crimea and the city of Sevastopol. It also marks 8 years since Russia's forcibly seized 10,000 square miles of sovereign Ukrainian territory, in flagrant violation of international law and Russia's own international commitments. And it's also 8 years since we, the General Assembly of the United Nations, record through Resolution 68262 the obligations of all states under Article 2 of the UN Charter to refrain from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state of the United Nations. Yet, 8 years on, tragically, here we are again, confronted by Russian aggression against the sovereignty of Ukraine. And as Secretary General Antonio Guterres has made clear, Russia's unilateral measures conflict directly with the very principles of the United Nations Charter. Their actions are a fundamental challenge to global peace and security, and a challenge to the international order on which we all rely. And equally important, it is for all of us to protect. We must condemn unequivocally this aggression together and stop President Putin's expansionist ambitions. Mr. President, we must hold Russia true to its commitments under the UN Charter and say to Russia very clearly, pull back, choose peace, not war, whilst also sending a very clear message to the people of Ukraine that in your hour of need, we, the international community, we, the United Nations, stand with you. Thank you.
I thank the Minister for...
So that was Lord Ahmed, Foreign Office Minister, saying that the Kremlin must understand that the world will act. If Russia continues the aggression, there will be more sanctions, he said. We're confronted by Russian aggression, and it conflicts directly with the UN Charter. It'll be very interesting to see, as the afternoon progresses, what the Russians have to say, and also because they will be making their case at this General Assembly. It'll be good to see what they say, and also interesting to see what the Chinese have to say. Let's go back to the General Assembly.
We meet today in a time of challenge. A couple of days ago, the president of a member state of this organization put into question the statehood of another distinguished member of this organization. He said, and I quote, "Ukraine actually never had stable traditions of statehood," unquote. We must take this sentence very seriously. Some important questions arise. What does it mean for this organization if one state construes the existence of another state as a regrettable accident of history, thereby questioning its right to exist? What does it mean for a common objective of promoting peace and development if more countries try to roll back history in a similar way? What does it mean for the multilateral rules-based order if states think they can, due to their own view of history, domineer over other states and put them under tutelage? We still do not have answers to all of these questions. What is clear already now? Russia's decision to recognize the self-proclaimed so-called People's Republics of Donetsk and Luhansk could be a deadly blow for the international rules-based order, for the way this organization has functioned over the last decades. Russia is violating the core principles of the UN Charter. We need to close ranks and strongly reject such action. If not, then what has hit Ukraine today could happen to other UN member states tomorrow. Everybody in this assembly should be aware of this. It is therefore with utmost gratitude that we took note of the Secretary General's words. He said, "The principles of the UN Charter are not a menu a la carte. They cannot be applied selectively. Member states have accepted them all, and they must apply them all." Ladies and gentlemen, there is nothing to add to these crystal clear words. Russia's irresponsible and provocative action comes at a time of a massive military buildup alongside Ukraine's borders. We have seen a concerning flare-up of ceasefire violations along the line of contact. We have witnessed a disturbing flow of disinformation and false flag operations meant to create pretexts for military incursion. This time of increased tensions, where people's lives are at risk, would have been the time to go for de-escalation, to heed the Security Council repeated calls for diplomatic efforts. Instead, Russia chose to again attack Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity 8 years after Russia had illegally seized and annexed Crimea. The General Assembly condemned this UN Charter violation, and it should do so again. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. President, I commend Ukraine's continued restraint in the face of this aggression. President Zelensky's commitment to finding a peaceful diplomatic way out. Since 2014, France and Germany have done their utmost to work towards a political solution of the conflict in eastern Ukraine on the basis of the Minsk agreements. Russia's signature is under these agreements. Over the last weeks, Chancellor Scholz and my Foreign Minister Baerbock have left no stone unturned to engage with Russia diplomatically in close coordination with our French partners. We are willing to chart a way forward, strengthening trust, stability, and security in Europe. We have the framework established to do this. in the NATO-Russia Council, in the OSCE, and in the Normandy format. The ceasefire in the Donbass must be observed immediately. We condemn the use of heavy weaponry and indiscriminate shelling of civilian infrastructure, which constitutes a clear violation of the Minsk agreements. This must stop. We commend the OSCE Special Representative for trying to convene an extraordinary session of the Trilateral Contact Group. France, Ukraine, and my country stand ready for another meeting in the Normandy format or for the summit that Ukraine has proposed. The OSCE Special Monitoring Mission is vital for monitoring the situation in eastern Ukraine. This is why Germany's seconded staff remains on the ground. The SMM must be allowed to carry out its mandate in full. We want to resolve this crisis by diplomacy. To this end, Russia must immediately change its course of action. First, I urge Russia to de-escalate now, to withdraw its troops from Ukraine, in particular from the self-proclaimed entities and the Crimean Peninsula, as well as from Ukraine's borders. Second, Russia must refrain from any action which would further fuel the risk of a full-fledged military conflict with Ukraine. Third, I urge Russia to immediately repeal its decision to recognize the separatist entities. Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, do we respect the territorial integrity and sovereign equality of UN member states? Do we stand by the UN Charter? I call on all member states to reaffirm our commitment to these principles over Ukraine and beyond. With our allies and partners, Germany will spare no effort to find a diplomatic way forward. We will be steadfast in our support for Ukraine, in our support for the UN Charter. It is a common duty to remain committed to a rules-based order, to trustful cooperation, to bringing forward a common goal of lasting peace and stability. We invite every member of this organization to join these efforts. Now, ladies and gentlemen, is the moment to speak up and defend the international order of the UN Charter against unilateral aggression, jointly and decisively. I thank you.
I thank the Minister of State in the Federal Foreign Office of Germany.
Okay, well, that was Tobias Lindner from Germany making a very similar case to Lord Ahmed, and they are, well, one after the other condemning Russia for their actions in Donbass and their build-up of troops, and also, though, calling for dialogue and more negotiation as the way out of this. I think now we can hear from the EU representative.
The legal, moral and political authority of your office, clarifying the implications of what we are now seeing on the European continent and how it relates to the UN Charter. Mr. President, I will speak on behalf of the European Union and its member states. North Macedonia, Montenegro and Albania, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Iceland and Norway, Georgia and Monaco align themselves with this statement. Mr. President, the European Union recalls its unwavering support to the sovereignty, territorial integrity and independence of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. We strongly condemn the decision by the President Putin to recognize the non-government controlled areas of Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts of Ukraine as independent entities and the ensuing decision to send Russian troops into these areas. If there was any uncertainty, the Secretary General has made clear that the decision of the Russian Federation is a violation of the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine and inconsistent with the principles of the Charter of this United Nations. They undermine Ukraine's sovereignty and independence and are a severe breach of international law and international agreements, including the UN Charter, Helsinki Final Act, Paris Charter and the Budapest Memorandum. With this decision, Russia is clearly violating the Minsk agreements. The European Union strongly condemns Russia's continued aggression against Ukraine, including through the unprecedented military buildup near the border with Ukraine and in the Black Sea, and through the deployment of combat forces in and the joint drills with Belarus, and calls on Russia to de-escalate, to abide by international law, and to engage constructively in dialogue through the established international mechanisms. The EU is responding to these latest violations with additional restrictive measures, including on all economic relations with the non-governmental controlled areas, as well as designations against individuals and entities responsible for undermining the territorial integrity of Ukraine, in coordination with our partners. Russia's past and present actions against Ukraine are not a matter just for Ukraine or for Europe. They have severe global implications. Violations of fundamental principles of international law and the UN Charter directed towards another state is of serious global concern. These rules apply to all, and permanent members of the Security Council have particular responsibility in upholding the Charter. The EU fully subscribes to, and for its part reaffirms, our full commitment to the core principles of European security, enshrined in the UN Charter and the commitments Russia itself has subscribed to. This includes notably the sovereign equality and territorial integrity of states, the inviolability of frontiers, refraining from the threat or use of force, and the freedom of states to choose or change their own security arrangements. These principles are neither negotiable nor subject to revision or reinterpretation. Their violation by Russia is an obstacle to a common security space in Europe and threatens the peace and stability in Europe and worldwide. What is happening in Ukraine affects the security of each and every UN member state. We therefore call on Russia to respect the principles of the Charter.
Okay, we are going to leave the General Assembly temporarily, and we're going to talk to the former UK Ambassador to Washington, Lord Kim Darroch. Thank you very much for being with us. And we're hearing, Lord Darroch, a lot of condemnation there of the Russians and a lot of calls for negotiation and for diplomacy to take place. But is there anything, in your view, at this stage that the UN can really meaningfully do?
To be frank, Mark, I don't think there is. I think there's going to be a lot of very similar speeches. You've been hearing some of them today in the UN. But meanwhile, the Americans have cancelled any concept of meetings between the Secretary of State and Lavrov, or between President Biden and President Putin. So I kind of feel that unless the Russians make a move to initiate another round of diplomacy, then there isn't going to be more diplomatic activity, at least for the moment.
I mean, Vladimir Putin did say today, it was on Russian television, he was saying that he is open to direct and honest dialogue. What did you read into that?
Yeah, it was interesting statement from him, and see, we should think about what that means. But it didn't say, it seemed to me to be saying, I would like to initiate further dialogue with NATO, with the United States, with the Europeans. It sounded to me more like he was inviting us to come to him again. And as I said, it doesn't feel to me, at least from Washington, that they're going to do that. Though there may be some European leaders who want to respond to that. I mean, look, you never say never, especially when we're in as dangerous and ominous a situation as now. And if there is scope for further diplomacy, obviously it should be taken. But I'm not hopeful, to be frank.
Right, so let's talk about what seems to be happening. It's 48 hours or so since Vladimir Putin ordered his troops into these breakaway republics, but there's still precious little evidence that they have arrived in any great number. What do you think is going on at the moment?
Look, it's really hard to read this because one might have expected quite a substantial influx of Russian troops after that announcement. And it's not happening, it doesn't seem to be happening. So it's a puzzle. My biggest fear about all of this, Mark, is Putin also announced, I think in the last 24 hours, that the recognition of these two breakaway regions, Donetsk and Luhansk, is in accordance with the territory outlined in their constitutions. Now, the separatists only occupy about a third of these two regions. And if Putin's statement means that he intends to, as it were, reunite these separatist regions with the rest of Donetsk and Luhansk, that means engaging with the Ukrainian army across the line of separation that divides at the moment the separatists from the Ukrainian military. And that's basically starting a war. So again, it's not absolutely clear whether that's what Putin means, but again, that sounds rather ominous to me.
It does sound ominous, and it almost, well, it would almost certainly amount to a declaration of war if they took another chunk of Ukraine. But it's interesting that there are all these mixed messages. He does something and then holds back from doing something else that people think he's going to do. It's an extraordinary situation.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of the way Putin does this stuff, isn't it? I mean, his performance with his National Security Council was extraordinary. It was one of the most bizarre things I have seen in 40-odd years of involvement in diplomacy. It was sort of borderline unhinged, the whole thing. But it's not unusual for him to send very mixed and confusing messages deliberately. And he'd been saying for a long while there was no intention for Russia to invade Ukraine, and then we get the announcement that they'd recognise these two breakaway regions, and that Russian troops were going in. So there's already quite a lot of evidence of deliberately mixed messages from Putin, I think to keep the West guessing and keep the Ukrainians guessing and keep us all off balance in the hope this gives him some tactical advantage.
I guess it's also possible that he himself doesn't quite know what he's going to do at the end of all this. But what about NATO and what about sanctions and the West? Is it enough to deter him, what they're doing so far, do you think, or at least make him maybe think twice?
Well, I think actually that the package of sanctions that has come out in the last 24 hours, I mean, I think one can argue that the Brits undershot a bit if you compare what they have done with, say, what the EU did and what the United States has done. But it's clearly just a first package in the expectation that we will need to bring more sanctions in at some point in future if this Russian aggression continues and worsens, if we actually get into a major escalation. The biggest thing so far is the German announcement of a suspension, not a cancellation, but a suspension of Nord Stream 2. That would have doubled Russian gas supplies to Western Europe. And that must be quite a big loss for them. I mean, Russians don't do much in the way of exports apart from oil and gas. So this is going to be a big hit for their economy. As far as the UK is concerned, when we get into the next round, which the Prime Minister promised, I think earlier today in House of Parliament, I think our unique selling point, our USP, is the whole financial sector, and it means more action against Russian banks, freezing the assets, travel bans on more Russian oligarchs. Somewhere in the future, but I think this will be a final step, means maybe action on the SWIFT international payment system.
John Bolton was making a point about Nord Stream earlier on Sky News. He was saying that, yes, the Germans have halted the certification of the pipeline. He was saying that now they should go further and say that the whole thing is suspended until all your forces are removed from the threatening positions around Ukraine.
I mean, again, Mark, it depends whether you think we should have thrown everything into this first round of sanctions, or whether you want to hold something back as a deterrent against the Russians going further, against the Russians going further into Donetsk and Luhansk, or doing a land bridge to Crimea, or other military options open for them. Personally, I think it's not a bad thing for the West to hold some of its bigger cards in reserve. just in case, and I mean, maybe it's a forlorn hope, just in case that has some sort of deterrent effect on the Russians escalating further. But John Bolton is an experienced diplomat, a very hardliner on Russia, and is, of course, entitled to his views.
And it's very difficult to read the coming days and weeks, isn't it? We can't clearly read Putin's mind. But given where his forces are, and given, in fact, I'm going to interrupt myself, in fact, Lord Darrett, we're going to go back to the General Assembly because I think we're about to hear from the Lithuanians. So, Lord Darrett, look, I appreciate your time. Thank you very much indeed. And there we are, we're back at the General Assembly, and we're just waiting, I think, for Lithuania, who have been speaking this morning. The Lithuanian president has been in Ukraine and has been talking to President Zelensky and talking about candidate status for the EU. So they have been in Ukraine this morning. Let's just have a listen at the Assembly.
Secretary General, Excellencies. I have the honor to speak on behalf of the 8 Nordic Baltic countries, Denmark, Estonia, Finland, Iceland, Latvia, Norway, Sweden, and my own country, Lithuania. All our countries have aligned with the statement of the European Union. Mr. President, despite the repeated calls for serious de-escalation by the UN Secretary General and recent intensive diplomatic efforts at all levels, Russia keeps dramatically escalating its aggressive actions against Ukraine. We strongly condemn the decision by President Putin to recognize the non-government controlled areas of Donetsk and Luhansk Oblast of Ukraine as independent entities and the ensuing decision to send Russian troops into these areas under the pretext of so-called peacekeeping. We call on Russia to reverse these decisions. As clearly stated by UN Secretary General and political leaders of our countries, these illegal acts further undermine Ukraine's sovereignty and independence and constitute a severe breach of international law and international agreements, including the UN Charter, Helsinki Final Act, Paris Charter, and Budapest Memorandum. We underline that Russian forces in Donetsk and Luhansk Oblast of Ukraine would be nothing else than an invasion of a sovereign state. Calling them peacekeepers, to quote the Secretary General, is the perversion of the concept of peacekeeping. By these illegal acts, Russia is breaking its commitment to work with the Normandy format and the Trilateral Contact Group in finding a peaceful settlement to the conflict. It is also violating UN Security Council Resolution 2202, which requires full implementation of the Minsk agreements. The Russian Federation's use of force against Ukraine is completely unjustified and unacceptable and must be met with unity, firmness, and determination, including through additional sanctions in solidarity with Ukraine. Russia's continued aggressive actions and threats against Ukraine and its recent unprecedented and large-scale military buildup in Ukraine and near its borders, including through deployment of combat forces in and the joint drills with Belarus, pose a threat not only to European but also to the global security. In addition, Russia's increased military presence in the Black Sea and in the illegally annexed Crimean Peninsula, as well as the closure of the large parts of the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov, add to the threat of escalation also in the maritime sphere. Non-adherence to international law and its fundamental principles undermines the rules-based international order and effective multilateralism. We underscore the crucial importance of upholding these principles, including to the right of all states to the sovereign equality, territorial integrity, and political independence, as well as freedom of states to choose their own security arrangements. The Nordic and Baltic countries stand in full solidarity with Ukraine, supporting its territorial integrity, sovereignty, and independence within its internationally recognized borders. Russia has a clear and direct responsibility under international law to work to find a peaceful settlement of the conflict. We call on Russia to respect the principles of the UN Charter, to de-escalate, and to choose to engage in the meaningful diplomacy. Mr. President, In 3 days, we will mark the 8th anniversary of the illegal annexation of Crimea and the city of Sevastopol by the Russian Federation. The Nordic and Baltic countries continue to condemn this blatant violation of international law and remain committed to implementing the EU's non-recognition policy, including through restrictive measures. We call on UN member states to consider similar measures in accordance with the UN General Assembly, the Resolution 68/262. We continue to condemn the increasing militarization of the Crimean Peninsula and the severe deterioration of the human rights situation there. We recall the obligation of all states not to recognize as lawful any territorial acquisition or special advantage resulting from the use of armed forces. The Russia-instigated conflict has resulted in around 14,000 deaths, 1.5 million displaced, countless damages and suffering of those living on the both sides of the contact line. Furthermore, we are witnessing Russia's continued effort of de facto integration and systematic demographic changes of the illegally annexed Crimea, as well as non-government controlled areas in Donetsk and Luhansk regions of Ukraine, including through accelerated issuing of Russian passports on the massive scale to Ukrainian citizens and forced conscription to the Russian armed forces. Such moves are making the conflict resolution efforts even more difficult. We are concerned about reported arbitrary detentions and arrests, especially of Crimean Tatars and Ukrainian-speaking minorities, increasing pressure on journalists and media workers, human rights defenders, and other members of civil society. Russia must fully respect international law, including international humanitarian law and international human rights law. We call for the immediate release of all illegally detained and imprisoned persons in the Crimean Peninsula and in Russia. It is essential that international organizations and human rights actors have unhindered access to the areas currently not under control of the Ukraine and the Crimean Peninsula, in accordance with UN General Assembly Resolution 76/179 of the 16th December 2021. We urge Russia to withdraw its forces and materiel from within Ukraine, including the Crimean Peninsula and non-government controlled areas of Luhansk and Donetsk Oblast, as well as from areas adjacent to its borders, and to immediately stop fueling the conflict. We reiterate our full support to the efforts towards peaceful and sustainable resolution of this conflict through the established international mechanisms. We commend Ukraine for its constructive approach and urge Russia to assume its responsibility as a party to the conflict, upholding its commitments, abide by the international law, and return to the discussions within the Normandy format and the Trilateral Contact Group. It is essential that the OSCE Special Monitoring Mission have free and unhindered access through Ukraine, including the Crimean Peninsula and non-government controlled areas in Donetsk and Luhansk Oblast of Ukraine, in accordance with its mandates. We are deeply concerned regarding the continued restrictions of the mission's freedom of movement, including security incidents involving its staff and assets. Mr. President, the position of Nordic and Baltic countries is clear. It is our duty as members of the UN to defend the rules-based international order. Challenges to this order clearly affect the international community as a whole. We urge Russia to abide by international law and uphold its international commitments. Like the Secretary General, we recall the obligations under the UN Charter of all members to refrain from the threat or use of force and to settle the international disputes by peaceful means. We thank the Secretary General for his clear message on Russia's aggressive actions and call for the UN to continue efforts to restore respect for the sovereignty, territorial integrity, political independence, and unity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Lithuania, who spoke on behalf of the 8 Nordic Baltic countries. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Russian Federation.
Господин председатель,
Mr. President, Secretary General, I would like to start my statement with a clarification. The agenda item which we are meeting to discuss today has clearly been given the wrong title. If it is supposed to reflect reality, then it should not be temporarily occupied territories, but rather territories lost as a result of the hate-filled policy against its own citizens that Kiev has turned into a national idea after the illegitimate Maidan coup of 2014. As regards those citizens who were not in agreement with that coup, as soon as the current regime came to power, with the tacit endorsement of its Western backers, a policy of systemic deprivation of basic human rights inter alia on ethnic grounds was implemented. We understand the focus of today's discussion is the recognition by the Russian Federation of the DLR and the LPR as the current affairs event of the day. There is currently a great deal of speculation and insinuation surrounding this decision. I'd like to underscore that what happened was a direct result of Kiev's years-long sabotage of their direct obligations under the package of measures adopted in Security Council Resolution 2202. As soon as it was signed in February 2015, Russia was consistently committed to this complicated internal Ukrainian compromise. We did all we could to preserve the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine. We organised numerous UN Security Council meetings, area formula meetings. We actively participated in the work of the Normandy format and the Minsk contact group. We discussed the situation in the east of Ukraine in the Organisation for Security and Cooperation in Europe. This is despite the fact that Russia is not a party to the Minsk process and is not and was not. All this was in vain. For 8 years, Kiev continued and is continuing to bomb its own citizens and shirk from direct dialogue with Donbass. It has led, over the past 8 years, the entire international community up the garden path, insisting on its commitment to the Minsk agreements, but only through its interpretation, and thus has sabotaged the work of the Minsk contact group. Most of you don't even understand what the contact group meetings were like. The Ukrainian representatives sabotage the implementation not only of political issues but economic and other issues as well. However, recently the Ukrainian leadership have stopped having scruples. They've told the cameras directly that they do not intend to uphold their commitments. Perhaps the last straw, the last confirmation of this was the fact that the Ukrainian PR unambiguously confirmed this during the Security Council meeting we organised on the 17th of February. However, our Western colleagues did not even urge Ukraine to implement Minsk. It became clear that there were no more prospects for Kiev implementing this document. It is precisely because of Kiev's unwillingness to consider the interests of a broad swathe of its population that since 2014 Ukraine has been at war with its own citizens who do not agree with the Maidan values and the current policy of the authorities. The Ukraine's Western backers did nothing to convince Kiev to heed its own people, thus demonstrating egregious double standards. In any other crisis situation, UN member states call for an inclusive, direct dialogue between the parties to the conflict. If this does not occur, an internal conflict cannot be resolved. However, with Ukraine, everything was completely the other way around. The cornerstone of the package is dialogue, and this has been sabotaged by Ukraine all this time. It is to our great regret that the UN Secretary General today and a few days ago has made some statements regarding what is going on in the east of Ukraine that are not in line with his status and his mandate under the UN Charter. we specifically looked at the statistics and former files and dossiers, and we saw that there was no conflict when the Secretary General, be this the current one or his predecessors, allowed himself to make such statements regarding any country. Regarding the situation in the Ukraine, the Secretary General has raised his voice often to uphold all the requirements of the packet of measures under Security Council Resolution 2202 that directly require all matters to be resolved between agreement with Kiev and Donbass. Nobody in the West mentioned that at all. Unfortunately, the Secretary General has followed this very sad example. In these circumstances, we don't understand what good offices that the Secretary General talked about can be provided. The people in Crimea and Donetsk and Lugansk declared their independence. Crimea was luckier. Its inhabitants almost immediately said they wanted to accede to Russia, and they came under the protection of the Russian Federation. The people of Donetsk and Lugansk, to whom our German and French partners had promised a just settlement, had to wait our recognition over a long 8-year period. During this time, at the behest of our Western colleagues, there was still a glimmer of hope that Kiev would have a change of heart and start dialogue with its citizens. However, the Maidan authorities didn't have such plans in mind. Over that period, it carried out 2 heinous, bloody military adventures, culminating in the Ukrainian army routing the self-defense fighters and flouting the Minsk agreements. Instead of implementing them, Kiev right from the start nurtured plans for revenge without ceasing to shell residential areas and to conduct sabotage. Furthermore, it's important to bear in mind that over the years, Ukraine irrevocably became anti-Russia and waged a war on the Russian language and all that is Russian as part of its state policies. The country has seen the emergence of a linguistic inquisition. The area where the Russian language can be used has significantly shrunk and has been subject to repression. Under President Zelensky, who during his pre-election campaign donned the garb of a peacekeeper and a protector of the interests of all Ukrainians, under him there was a ban introduced on broadcasting 6 opposition TV channels. Lies about World War II have taken deep root. Hitler's comrades in arms have become heroes, and the real heroes have become nobodies. We don't agree with Kiev's policy. Those people who didn't agree have been persecuted, and there's been physical harm and massacres and murders of journalists and others. Thus, it was clear to the people of Donetsk and Lugansk what kind of Ukraine they were being asked to return to. However, even faced with this, they did not waver from implementing the Minsk agreements. They believed that the document would be implemented and they would be granted special status. As it turned out, these hopes were dashed. Today, we are all aware of the horrific figure of 14,000 victims of the conflict, including hundreds of children. The overwhelming majority of them are inhabitants of Donetsk and Lugansk. All these years, there's been an economic, transport, and food embargo on Donbass. Elderly people and children have to hide from shelling. The number of refugees who are being rescued and going to Russia and not Ukraine, over the past few days alone has reached tens of thousands. 96,000 people today alone. For any civilized state, it's clear that you can't treat your people like that. That means Kiev doesn't need Donbass inhabitants. It only needs their land. And this is something that President Zelensky said this clearly, telling them that they should get away and go to Russia. However, the Kiev authorities are dubbing these people very disparagingly terrorists. Having become convinced the situation was hopeless, we decided that the people of Donbass are fully within their rights to consider themselves independent. You know the rest. Distinguished colleagues, Given the blatant genocide and the trampling on the most important human right of all, the right to life, our country could not remain indifferent to the fate of the 4 million people of Donbass. We primarily have been guided by the fact that the greatest value of all is that of human life. In criticizing us for our decision, you are showing utter indifference for the fate of the Donetsk and Lugansk people, just as Kiev and its Western backers have done during these 8 years of conflict. This conflict is by no means over. Shelling of residential areas in both republics has not ceased. The West continues to goad and to provoke and to arm Kiev. We warn you that since, upon the request of Donetsk and Lugansk, the ceasefire will be monitored by the Russian armed forces, no one intends to go softly with any violators. Therefore, we urge you today to focus efforts on reining in Kiev and deterring it from conducting a new military adventure that might cost the whole of Ukraine very dearly. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished...
Well, there we are. That was the Russian representative there. And if you were looking for any sign of compromise, there wasn't much there. He said the UN debate is even titled wrongly. He said it's described as being about temporarily occupied territories. But he said it should be called the territories lost as a result of the hate-filled policies of Ukraine. He said Ukraine is shelling its own citizens, Ukraine sabotaged the implementation of agreements over those territories, and he said that there was fighting going on and that children were hiding from Ukrainian shelling. The overwhelming number of victims were in Donetsk and Luhansk, and he called it blatant genocide and said Russia could not remain indifferent. He also said, near the end there, this conflict is by no means over, and then talked about the Russian armed forces monitoring some sort of ceasefire. Well, the Assembly meeting is continuing. We'll bring in our US correspondent, Mark Stone, in a moment, but first, our Europe correspondent, Adam Parsons. And, well, Adam, I don't know whether you heard the Russian representative there, but not much in it to be too optimistic about.
Oh, no. I mean, that wasn't just doubling down. That was tripling, quadrupling down. That was a statement of intent. And as you said right at the end, saying we will monitor the ceasefire and we will not be going softly. I mean, he raised the spectre of calling the 2014 invasion actually a response to a coup. And made it absolutely clear that he thinks that the UN, the world, has got this wrong, and that Russia has a right to recognise the independence of these two areas. So there was absolutely nothing there about conciliation. He following on the footsteps of the representative from Lithuania, who of course took the absolute reverse position and said that Russian aggression was a threat to Europe, to the eastern flank of Europe. And that, Mark, has been, I think, the message that has come across very strongly today is that Lithuania and Poland, well, their leaders were in Ukraine just a couple of hours ago, showing their endorsement. I can tell you the European Union has signed off a package of sanctions. We haven't got the details of that today. They are expected to be, for instance, a lot tougher than the ones that have been agreed by the UK. There will be an emergency meeting of the European Council. That means all 27 leaders from EU countries will be coming here to Brussels tomorrow night. There's a meeting of the G7. Of course, it used to be the G8 until Russia was thrown out of it. Also an extraordinary meeting here of the European Parliament. Every cog of European diplomacy has now started moving and moving pretty fast. These sanctions were not every European country wanted them in the same place and in this to be brought about in the same speed, but they are there and they will target individuals. I expect to see high-ranking Russian politicians, potentially the deputy Prime Minister, the Defence Minister, the Economy Minister, the Foreign Affairs spokeswoman, Maria Zakharova, the Editor-in-Chief of Russia Today. These people are likely to face sanctions from the European Union, and I think Ukraine and Eastern European countries are going to call on other nations, notably the UK, to toughen up the sanctions. They still want a diplomatic solution here in Brussels.
Adam, I'm going to stop you there. We're going back to the UN General Assembly, and we think it is the turn of the Americans to have their say. We're just going to wait a second, because they do have to, a lot of COVID stuff going on there. Have to cloth down the podium. But we think it is the Americans next. But we've heard an absolutely, another rant from the Russians and blaming everything on the Ukrainians and no sign of compromise at all. Let's listen to what the Americans have to say.
Crossroads in the history of this body. On Monday, President Putin announced that Russia would recognize as independent states the so-called DNR and LNR regions, part of the sovereign territory of Ukraine, controlled by Russia's proxies since 2014. He then ordered Russian military forces, under the guise of so-called peacekeepers, to deploy to these regions. In the hours that followed, Secretary General Guterres said this was a violation of the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine and inconsistent with the principles of the Charter of the United Nations. He reaffirmed that to us in his remarks today. In an emergency meeting Monday night, all but one member of the Security Council called for dialogue and diplomacy, which can only happen if Russia abandons its unprovoked further aggression toward Ukraine. Has Russia heeded these calls? No. Instead, it has responded with additional actions to undermine Ukraine's sovereignty, including mass disinformation, which we just heard again today, cyber attacks, and efforts to create a false flag pretext, in addition to Russia's overwhelming military buildup of more than 150,000 troops near Ukraine's border. Russia's actions have only confirmed what we and other nations have been warning about. Other UN member states must recognize the threat before us all today, before it's too late. Colleagues, there's no middle ground here. Calling for both sides to de-escalate only gives Russia a pass. Russia is the aggressor here. History tells us that looking the other way is ultimately the more costly path. And we need only to look across the past decade for an indication of the path that Russia is taking. Since 2014, Russia has occupied Crimea following its illegal invasion and has been manufacturing and fueling ongoing military conflicts in eastern Ukraine. In recent years, including President Putin's remarks this week, Russian leaders have claimed that Ukraine is not a real country. They have questioned its right to exist. Russia's actions are an unprovoked violation of international law, of Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, and a direct contradiction of the Minsk agreements. Russia's aggression not only threatens all of Ukraine, but every member state and the UN itself. Colleagues, President Putin gave us the clearest indication of his intentions on Monday when he asked the world to travel back in time by more than 100 years before the United Nations even existed to an age of empires. He asserted that Russia can recolonize its neighbors and that he will use force to make a farce of the United Nations. The United States rejects that firmly. This is 2022. We're not going back to an era of empires and colonies or to the USSR or the Soviet Union. We have moved forward, And we must ensure, as the permanent representative from Kenya said in the Security Council on Monday night, that the embers of dead empires do not ignite new forms of oppression and violence. Unfortunately, the fake reality Russia wants to create is already having real consequences for the people of Ukraine and for the world. To date, Russia's war in eastern Ukraine has already killed more than 14,000 people, nearly 3 million Ukrainians, half of whom are elderly people and children, need food, shelter, and other life-saving assistance. And of course, ordinary Russians should be asking how many Russian lives Putin is willing to sacrifice to feed his ambitions. If Russia continues down this path, it could, according to our estimates, create a new refugee crisis, one of the largest facing the world today, with as many as 5 million more people displaced by Russia's war of choice and putting pressure on Ukraine's neighbors. And because Ukraine is one of the world's largest wheat suppliers, especially for the developing world, Russia's actions could cause a spike in food prices and lead to even more desperate hunger in places like Libya, Yemen, and Lebanon. The tidal wave of suffering this war will cause are unthinkable. And then there's the broader threat that Russia's actions upend our international system, make a mockery of the UN Charter, and call into question our most fundamental principles of sovereignty, diplomacy, and territorial integrity. Unfortunately, despite these terrible world-altering outcomes, Russia appears determined to proceed. Together with our partners and allies, President Biden has taken decisive action to make the cost of Russia's actions crystal clear. But as much as we all want Russia to de-escalate and choose the path of peace, that is not our choice to make. This is President Putin's war of choice. If he chooses to escalate further, Russia and Russia alone will bear full responsibility for what is to come. What we can do together today is make clear that Russia will pay an even steeper price if it continues this aggression, that responsible countries do not bully their neighbors into submission, that former empires cannot lay claim to sovereign and independent nations. The very first line of the UN Charter states, "We are uniting together," quote, "determined to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war." This, right here, right now, is a moment. It is a moment when we can save this generation and the next from that terrible fate. Colleagues, now is not the time to sit on the sidelines. Now is the time to get off of the sidelines. Let us together show Russia that it is isolated and alone in its aggressive actions. Let us stand fully behind the principles of sovereignty, political independence, and territorial integrity for Ukraine and for all member states. Let us show Russia that every other UN member state believes it is time to de-escalate, to come back to the negotiating table, and to work toward peace so that Ukrainians can live in security and the tenets of the UN Charter can be upheld for future generations to come. Thank you very much.
I thank the distinguished representative.
That was Linda Thomas Greenfield, the United States ambassador to the UN, and she was talking about how Russia must stop its unjustifiable and uncontrolled aggression towards Ukraine. We must recognize the threat before it is too late, she said. In recent years, Russian leaders have questioned Ukraine's right to exist. It is a flagrant breach of international law, she said, and a direct threat to Ukraine. And then she said this: the embers of dead empires must not ignite new conflicts. And if there was a sentence designed to infuriate President Putin, that would probably be it. Former empires cannot take neighbouring independent countries. She said, this is Russia's war of choice. The result will be a human catastrophe and a tidal wave of suffering. Russia is making a mockery of the UN Charter. This is a moment, she said, we must show Russia it is isolated. Let's leave the General Assembly for just a moment and go to Washington and our US correspondent, Mark Stone. Well, Mark, I mean, if you wanted two more diametrically opposed speeches, you just take the Russian one and then you take the American one.
Yes, and by chance, the two were almost one after the other. You know, we were saying earlier, there's something about the power of words spoken in that chamber. They really do resonate. The world pays attention when words are spoken by diplomats at the UN in New York. For years, it goes by without the news channels dipping into it, and then suddenly a crisis like this, and all eyes are on that chamber. And I think the words of the Ukrainian foreign minister opening the chamber, the plenary session, were extremely powerful. And then following him, many other nations going through pretty much all of the member states reacting to what Russia has done, and then just slotted in there one country alone that has a different view, and that is the Russian Federation. I was struck by what Linda Thomas Greenfield said there. She not only called out Russia's actions, and she quoted that very powerful address from the Kenyan representative last week, where he talked about the embers of empire. She re-quoted him there. But she also pointed out the multiple consequences of a full-scale war in the heart of Europe. And she talked not only about the huge suffering within Ukraine if Russia was to proceed westwards with more of an invasion, the huge human casualties to add to those already facing Ukraine, but she talked too about the massive influx of refugees that we would see into Western Europe as a consequence of what would happen if there was an invasion. And she talked too about the unintended consequences, things that people might not have thought about, like the fact that Ukraine is a wheat supplier, a massive producer of wheat around the world. Much of it goes to the developing world, to places like Yemen, to Iraq, to Syria, places which desperately need food and will lose out as a consequence of this. The point that she was making is that this is a global crisis. She is, of course, given the chamber she's talking in, trying to gather and garner support and condemnation, united condemnation for what Russia is doing. But, you know, Mark, as Lord Darrach was saying earlier, the former UK ambassador to the United States, it's a talking house to a large extent because what diplomacy is left? The diplomats have basically stopped talking. Certainly the American diplomats are now not talking to their Russian counterparts at a foreign minister level. We know that the meeting that was due to take place tomorrow between Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, and Antony Blinken, the US Secretary of State, that has been cancelled. The Americans say they're not entertaining the idea of sitting around a table with the Russians at the moment. That said, they do say the window for diplomacy is still open, but it's not open at a high level. And I think all eyes now are on what Russia will do next, and the Russian reaction to the sanctions that we are seeing rolled out at the moment.
Okay, Mark, thank you very much indeed. Well, that's about it for the moment from Kiev. The rest of the day's news follows after this short break.
Well, it's a unique piece, and basically it was a bit of a surprise for my 21st birthday. My dad bought me this notebook for the simple reason I was in Hollyoaks at the time, and I played the character Jude Cunningham, and my dad was at home in Wigan, and I was on a night shoot in Liverpool, and for some reason he ended up on the phone to Sotheby's, And I think he was 2 bottles of wine in when he started bidding against an American. And he thought, I'll be damned if that goes to the USA, it's got to stay in Liverpool. And he ended up winning the bid and called me up when I was on set to say, guess what, you own the Hey Jude lyrics. And I'm like, what? That's a bit overwhelming for a 20-year-old. But after 20 odd years, we've decided to put it on public display at the Beatles Museum here in Liverpool, and it's their 30th anniversary. And I thought, you know what? It can't be under lock and key anymore. It can't, you know, these people really need to see it. The fans need to get back into Liverpool and understand this like amazing piece of rock and roll memorabilia. I've never touched it. You've got to wear white gloves and everything. It's completely secure. It's like, I mean, it's priceless, really. So no, I am too clumsy to touch it. I've obviously seen it, but the guys at the museum said, do you want to hold it? I'm like, no, don't give it to me. I'll break it. It's kind of like it's a family heirloom, I guess. I've got 4 boys, the Fab Four, and number 4 is actually called Jude. But I mean, I don't think we'll ever sell it. You know, to be honest, my dad bought it for him. He just used it as an excuse to buy it for me. Let's face it. But no, hopefully it'll stay in the family. But I just wanted to make sure that everybody in the world could benefit from it and understand it. And obviously Sir Paul's playing at Glastonbury this year. So that, I mean, loads more fans will start coming in and next generation will appreciate the brilliance that was the Beatles. I don't know any wedding, funeral, black tie-do that does not play Hey Jude. Everyone stands up and everyone sings to it. It's like a universal anthem. And I think one of my sons said to me yesterday, he says, it's a really famous song, Mummy. And I said, I think Hey Jude and Happy Birthday are the world's most famous songs, yeah.
A lot of action going on. I'm Alex Crawford and I'm Sky's special correspondent based in Istanbul.
This is what makes the job so fantastic.
I love my job because I get to do something that is contributing to a better future.
Let's take a look at some of today's other news now. And 2 severe flood warnings which pose a danger to life remain in place in Ironbridge and Bewdley along the River Severn this afternoon. The storms of last week, Dudley, Eunice and Franklin, have caused problems across the country and around 400 properties have been flooded. Communities are being urged to stay vigilant. Scotland Yard has questioned attendees at Downing Street lockdown parties under caution, raising the prospect that Boris Johnson will become the first Prime Minister to be questioned under caution by the police. The news emerged after a copy of the police questionnaire sent to Downing Street staff following those Partygate allegations was leaked. Passengers using London Underground will no longer be required to wear face masks from tomorrow. Transport for London says it made this decision following the government's approach to living with the virus, but still highly recommends that customers and staff wear face coverings if they are able to. A 35-year-old man has been given a 5-year restraining order after he was found guilty of stalking British tennis star Emma Raducanu. The court heard how Amrit Magar once walked 23 miles to the 19-year-old's home in a series of 3 visits to the property. On one occasion, he stole her father's shoe from the family's porch as a souvenir. Now, do you know where the money in your pension gets invested? If you're keen to help reduce climate change, then you might want to take note. New research seen by Sky News suggests that 2 out of every £10 invested in the average UK pension is linked to deforestation. That's according to a report by System IQ, Global Canopy, and Make My Money Matter. Sadia Chowdhury has more.
In saving for our future, UK pension contributions could be destroying the planets. Sky News can reveal that 20% of our average contributions is linked to deforestation.
All I want for Christmas is you.
Now, the screenwriter behind Notting Hill, Love Actually and Yesterday wants us to focus on tomorrow.
You might be fighting against cigarettes, you might be fighting against arms, and yet your pension's exactly contradicting your behaviour. So what you've got to do is just check them out and make sure that they're consistent with what you do and what you hope for and all your values.
In Britain, our total private pension wealth is worth over £6 trillion, but not everyone knows where this money goes.
Do you have a pension?
Yeah, through work.
And do you know where your money is being invested?
No.
It's through work. I trust them, but no, I don't know where it's being invested, no.
Where would you like for it to be invested?
I would like for it to be invested in more sustainable investments.
Curtis says there is power in our pensions and that greening up our contributions is 21 times better than if we give up flying, go vegetarian and switch energy providers.
It's just a shame to waste, as it were, this sitting power tool that you've got. And the moment you ask it and the moment you shift it, it'll be doing good every day of every year till you collect it. And with any luck, you will collect it in a better world.
But the greenest pension isn't necessarily the most profitable. And just weeks before a national insurance tax rise and at a time when the cost of living is rising, for some people it could be a tough decision. Sadia Chowdhury, Sky News.
The parents of a British man murdered in Cyprus 6 years ago have met Foreign Office officials today as part of their efforts to bring two known suspects to justice. George Lowe was just 22 when he was stabbed to death in Ayia Napa in Cyprus back in 2016. His alleged killers are thought to be hiding in Turkey, which has no extradition agreement with Cyprus. Our crime correspondent Martin Brunt takes up the story.
It's been a long day.
George Lowe, where he loved to be, at the heart of the party. Ayia Napa, Cyprus. A few hours later, he was dead.
He had a big circle of friends. Everybody just loved him. I think because he was such a character that you couldn't help but love him.
That night, the regular bar crawl ended in horror, in a knife attack. George, an estate agent, was stabbed to death. His best friend, Ben Barker, was badly injured, but survived.
Had George been involved in any kind of trouble like this before?
No, never. He wasn't. No. He wasn't. He would stick up for himself, but he wasn't a troublemaker. No.
Two suspects are still on the run from Cyprus police. Bulgarian Salih Ahmet, wanted for murder and attempted murder. And a Turk, Mehmet Akpinar, the same allegations. Ahmet has been seen in Turkey. It's believed Akpinar is there too, both protected by the absence of diplomatic relations between Turkey and Cyprus.
I would like Turkey to hand them over and for them to face trial in southern Cyprus and if they'll be found guilty to serve prison time.
In Instagram messages, apparently from Mehmet Akpinar, the suspect threatens survivor Ben Barker, then taunts him. Ben tells Akpinar he knows he wasn't the killer. Salih Ahmet was, but Akpinar does admit he stabbed Ben.
I think what Akpinar is trying to do is to just push all the blame onto Ahmet.
They can say all they like who done it and who didn't do it, but it's not, unless they're there standing in a court.
Yeah.
Where we need them to be.
At a meeting with Foreign Office officials, the family's MP said there was some hope of getting the suspects into court.
There are lots of possibilities. Either they could travel to another country where the European arrest warrants can be effective. There could be some better cooperation between northern and southern Cyprus. If either those two factors happen, then there is the possibility that we can actually see justice.
George's parents were only slightly optimistic.
There seems to be more communication going on, and that would be a help, a big help.
When we went to see George in the funeral home, we made him a promise that we would never ever give up fighting for justice for him, and we will hold that promise forever.
The Foreign Office said it continued to support George's family and was in contact with Cyprus authorities. Martin Brunt, Sky News, Central London.
Well, we're joined now by the family's local MP, Gareth Johnson, who you saw in Martin Brunt's report. Mr Johnson, thank you for joining us. Do you feel like some progress was made today?
Well, there was some limited progress, but certainly no breakthrough. I mean, it is absolutely heartbreaking, this case. Here was a man, George Lowe, who went out to Napa with his friend Ben Barker just for a holiday, and they were on the last day of their holiday as it happens, and they were butchered, is the only way I can put it, in a totally unprovoked attack. And the killers fled across from southern Cyprus to northern Cyprus and used the political situation there to their own advantage, and thereby evading arrest. And they remain at large and still are contacting Ben Barker, adding to the distress that the families have already suffered.
Yeah, it's absolutely horrific, the details that we saw in that report there of what's gone on since. The key to this, though, seems to be the Cypriot authorities and the Turkish authorities who, to put it one way, have been very much dragging their heels on this. Is there any sign from the Foreign Office that they will exert pressure on them?
But to be fair to the Foreign Office, I think they're doing all that they can, but you're absolutely right. The problem, and therefore the solution, lies in Cyprus. When I travelled out there to try and make some progress on this whole case, it was quite clear that southern Cyprus was not prepared to give any evidence to northern Cyprus because they don't recognise them as an organisation or country. And northern Cyprus were not prepared to do anything until they received any kind of evidence from the south. So we were stuck with this sort of logjam, if you like, this sort of political maelstrom that has held up this whole problem. And the consequence is you've got two killers out there, very, very dangerous men that have managed to evade justice, and you've got grieving families here in the UK, and justice simply hasn't been served. And that must concern anybody who travels to southern Cyprus, which is a beautiful country, but nevertheless has these political problems that enable killers quite literally to walk free and escape any kind of justice for the murders that they commit.
Yeah, George Lowe, just a young man going on holiday to Napa with a friend, as so many young men and women do every holiday season. Thoughts very much with the Lowe's family. Gareth Johnson, a Dartford MP, I know you're supporting them in their journey. We hope to speak to you with better news at some point soon here on Sky News. We'll keep following the story. Thank you. Well, that was the Sarah Jane Me Show. I'll be back tomorrow at 2 o'clock. Coming up, Mark Austin in
ba ma dalee commencé liggéey bi yokkute bu bari am nañ ko ci
It's 5 o'clock. You're watching the News Hour live from the Ukrainian capital, Kiev. I'm Mark Austin. Coming up in the next 60 minutes. Ukraine prepares to impose a state of emergency in the face of what it calls growing Russian aggression. President Putin accuses the West of ignoring Russia's legitimate security concerns. But Moscow faces condemnation as the UN General Assembly meets to discuss the crisis. Meanwhile, the UK asks watchdogs to monitor the Kremlin-backed TV channel RT. Also tonight, a man who walked 23 miles to Emma Raducanu's home is given a restraining order for stalking. And a threat to life remains along the River Severn, with 2 severe flood warnings still in place. Good evening from Kiev, the capital of a country soon to be living under a nationwide state of emergency. Ukraine is expected to introduce new measures from midnight, including the conscription of men of fighting age. Ukraine's leaders say it comes in the face of what it says is escalating Russian aggression. Earlier, Ukrainian government websites and those of the country's banks were hit by an apparent cyber attack. Tonight, we are live with our correspondents here in Kiev, in Washington, and also in Westminster on another fast-paced day of developments. Russia appears to be deploying more troops and material along Ukraine's border in western Russia and Belarus, according to satellite imagery from the US firm Maxar. Boris Johnson has announced that the UK will be providing more military assistance to Ukraine. The Prime Minister also says that the broadcasting regulator Ofcom has been asked to review the output of the Kremlin-backed TV channel RT, Russia Today. Meanwhile, the UN General Assembly has convened in New York to discuss the situation in Ukraine. More on all that in a moment, but first let's examine what's happening here on the ground in Ukraine. The country's state of emergency is expected to include bans on mass gatherings and union strikes. Regional authorities will be able to apply measures including additional protection for public facilities. There'll be restrictions on traffic and more transport and document checks. The Ukrainian president insisted the measures were necessary as he called out Russia's latest movements in the east of his country.
The military presence of the Russian Federation on the occupied territory of Donbass has been hiding behind separatist uniform, and now we see that this is a unilateral departure from Minsk agreement. And this is an undermining of Ukrainian and international attempts to regulate the situation on the Ukrainian Donbass.
Well, these are the areas of Ukraine Mr. Zelensky is talking about. Much of Donetsk and Luhansk are controlled by Russian-backed separatists. They make up the Donbass region. The United States says Russian troops are moving into those areas following President Putin's decision to formally recognize their independence. Meanwhile, these satellite images from the US firm Maxar appear to show that Russia has been sending more troops to Ukraine's eastern border. This shows equipment near Belgorod, around 10 miles from the border. The deployment includes a field hospital, and more than 100 Russian military vehicles have been photographed in Belarus near Ukraine's northern border, 3 days after military exercises were supposed to have finished. Well, Ukraine has almost 200,000 military personnel, large, but not when you compare it to Russia's 900,000 troops. Ukraine has 900,000 troops in reserve and trained compared with Russia's 2 million, and the Russians are far better equipped, of course. They have more than 6 times more tanks than Ukraine and nearly 7 times the number of armoured vehicles, plus 3 times the amount of artillery, including large gun-type weapons like cannons or mortars. In the air, it's a similar story. Russia has 10 times the number of attack aircraft and helicopters. The Ukrainians do have over 400 surface-to-air missile launchers capable of targeting aircraft, although that's very few compared with Russia. And Russia's dominance is greatest at sea. The Russian Navy operates 74 warships and 51 submarines compared to Ukraine's 2 warships and no submarines. Well, President Putin has today accused the West of ignoring Russia's legitimate security demands. He said he was still open to diplomacy, but that he would put Russian national security interests first. The Russian leader was seen today laying a wreath at the tomb of the unknown soldier to mark Defender of the Fatherland Day, the Russian army's main holiday. In a statement released to coincide with the public holiday, Mr. Putin said Russia would continue to bolster its military in the face of what he called a difficult international situation.
Our country stays open for direct and honest dialogue, for the search of diplomatic solutions for the most complex issues. But I will repeat, Russia's interests, our citizens' safety, are absolute. So we will continue strengthening and developing our army and navy, increasing their efficiency, providing them with the most advanced equipment.
Let's bring in our security and defence editor, Deborah Haynes, who is in Kiev here. And Deborah, well, a state of emergency, the call-up of reservists, things getting pretty tense here now.
They are. It's interesting, isn't it, to see the government now really acting as though it is a government under serious military threat. For the last couple of months, from the president downwards, they've been really kind of playing down the warnings from Western allies about the potential for a full-scale invasion. The Ukrainian president really sort of telling people previously not to panic. But tonight, the parliament is due to be voting on this state of emergency legislation, which would impose curbs on people's movements, travel movements, and potentially other sorts of restrictions such as curfews. We haven't got the full details yet, but it is a sign of a government that's preparing for potentially worse to come. It's already had to deal with the fact that Russia has sent or ordered troops to go into the east of the country, those Donetsk and Luhansk regions that have been in a frozen conflict for 8 years, but with such a scale of force around its borders and warnings again from Western allies, including, for example, the British Foreign Secretary, who today said she believed an attack on Kiev to be highly likely. They clearly aren't ignoring or openly, publicly ignoring them anymore. They are making it very clear that their people, the public, need to prepare. Again, it's no sense of panic. I was out in the streets today. We were just doing some gathering and speaking to people, and there's no sense that it's very calm. People are going about their usual business, but everybody is very mindful of the threat and the potential for this to escalate, and the fact that you've now got reservists being called up. It's not a mass mobilisation, but it's an interesting shift and a sign that this is a country that's preparing to have to deal with the horrors that could come.
Absolutely. Deborah, thank you very much. Well, EU leaders are to hold an emergency summit tomorrow, and in New York, the United Nations General Assembly has been discussing the crisis here in Ukraine. The UN Secretary General gave a stark warning of what might happen in the event of a wider Russian invasion of this country.
As we sadly know all too well, in conflict, civilians, including women and children, always suffer first and suffer most. If the conflict in Ukraine expands, the world could see a scale and severity of need unseen for many years. I urge all sides to allow safe and unimpeded access by humanitarian agencies, including in non-government controlled areas of eastern Ukraine.
Well, let's go live to Washington and our US correspondent Mark Stone. And Mark, we were talking earlier as we were listening to these speeches that there's well, there's not much to be optimistic about diplomatically.
Very powerful language on both sides, it has to be said, from the Russians too, who have been speaking. This was a plenary session that opened with the Ukrainian foreign minister, whose language was extremely powerful indeed. He talked about the world being at a critical juncture, a catastrophe in Europe that no nation will be able to sit out. And then following that, we heard from numerous other speakers representing their countries or their regions. There was a speaker for the European Union. Also, the Lithuanians spoke on behalf of the Baltic states. Of course, it is they who feel what they feel is Russian aggression much more readily than Western Europe does. We heard too from the Russian Federation, the Russian ambassador to the UN, painting a completely different picture. An alternate history lesson came from his mouth. The similar stuff that we've heard from Vladimir Putin himself, and ominous warnings there at the end of what the Russian speaker said, where he talked about potential bloodshed across Ukraine. And the Americans spoke to the American representative to the United Nations, again with very powerful language in a chamber where people do tend to sit up and listen.
We're not going back to an era of empires and colonies or to the USSR or the Soviet Union. We have moved forward, and we must ensure, as the permanent representative from Kenya said in the Security Council on Monday night, that the embers of dead empires do not ignite new forms of oppression and violence.
Now, one of the real concerns is clear on this map. You're looking here at the eastern part of Ukraine, and that region in yellow, those two regions in yellow are the separatist areas, but only the region covered with the shaded area is actually controlled. The LPR and the DPR, as they are separately known. Now, the concern here in Washington, among some quarters, is that President Putin will potentially look, given that he has said that these two states are independent, he will look to put Russian forces across those two areas that are in yellow, not just the shaded area, but the full yellow area. Now, if that comes to pass, then I think that is really, really very worrying indeed, because that would obviously mean a direct clash with Ukrainian soldiers, and that then could, so they say, here on this side of the Atlantic, lead very neatly for a pretext that Russia, they say, has been looking for to push forward towards Kiev.
Mark Stone there in Washington. What about here? Well, Boris Johnson, in London rather, Boris Johnson says more British weapons are being sent to Ukraine over fears of a full-scale invasion by Russia. The Prime Minister told the House of Commons that Moscow's behaviour was becoming increasingly threatening.
In light of the increasingly threatening behaviour from Russia and in line with our previous support, the UK will shortly be providing a further package of military support to Ukraine. Yeah. This will include lethal aid in the form of defensive weapons and non-lethal aid. I don't think people quite realise that the UK is out in front. We've sanctioned 275 individuals already. Yesterday we announced measures that place banks worth £37 billion, worth £37 billion under sanctions, in addition to more oligarchs. And, Mr. Speaker, there is more to come.
Well, the Labour leader, Sir Keir Starmer, questioned the government's past record on accepting donations from wealthy Russians.
Putin has invaded a sovereign European nation. He is attacked because he fears openness and democracy, and because he knows that, given a choice, people will not choose to live under erratic, violent rule. He seeks division. We must stay united. He hopes for inaction. So we must take a stand. He believes that we're too corrupted to do the right thing. Yeah. So we must prove him wrong. And I believe that we can. So will the Prime Minister work across the House to ensure that this is the end of the era of oligarch impunity by saying that this House and this country will no longer be homes for their loot?
Live to Westminster then, and our chief political correspondent, John Craig. And first of all, John, tell us more about these calls to close down the Russian broadcasters, RT, Russia Today.
Well, this was raised by Sir Keir Starmer yesterday and again today, but Sir Keir was rather wrong-footed when he called for RT to be stripped of its licence in the UK, because the Prime Minister revealed that Nadine Dorries, the Culture Secretary, has already written to the Ofcom, that's the broadcast regulator. Here's the letter. Demanding a review of the RT's licence. Now, she didn't get a particularly helpful reception, I don't think she would have thought, because the boss of Ofcom, that's Dame Melanie Dawes, rather than saying, yes, we're going to do that, simply said that we're expecting complaints about this. I'm confident we have the full range of enforcement tools at our disposal. Our track record shows we do take action. So I'm not sure that Nadine Dorries will be particularly satisfied with that response.
And the Defence Secretary, I gather, using some interesting language about President Putin.
Well, the normally sure-footed Defence Secretary Ben Wallace may be possibly accused of a gaffe with some rather unguarded language about President Putin. He was at an event alongside Priti Patel, the Home Secretary, talking to a lot of soldiers. It was all about giving visas to those from overseas who served the UK. Listen to the Defence Secretary's rather unguarded comments and a rather well, some would say quite a controversial claim about President Putin from Mr. Wallace.
Whether you're based in Cyprus or we do longer tours in Kenya or Oman, or are busy, we're just making it a brigade at the moment up in Estonia. It's going to be a busy army. And unfortunately, we've got some busy adversaries now. Putin gone full Tonto, I think it's something. And that is going to require. We've got 1,000 people on standby. Are you on standby? No. I think we should send the Gurkhas. We should send the Scots Guards kicked the backsides of Tsar Nicholas I in 1853 in Crimea. We can always do it again. We can always do it again. Well, Tsar Nicholas I made the same mistake Putin did.
On full Tonto, that was the claim by Mr. Wallace. Well, the dictionary definition of going Tonto includes having lost your mind, gone mental for no reason, lost the plot. Crazy. They're the words to describe, used to define going full Tonto. Did Mr. Wallace know exactly what he was doing? Was that a message he intended to get across? Or is he perhaps feeling a bit embarrassed? There will be plenty who say he knew exactly what he was doing, and that's the message he wanted to get across. Controversial, nevertheless.
And we'll probably never know. John Craig, thank you very much indeed. As I was saying a little earlier, Boris Johnson announced more military support for Ukraine at Prime Minister's questions today. It was a response perhaps to the criticism that the sanctions against Russia he announced yesterday don't go far enough. There was, however, a rare mood of unity in the Commons, as Joe Pike explains in PMQ's Unwrapped.
The very design of the House of Commons chamber is adversarial, and we have had weeks of angry confrontations over the PM's behaviour, his character and his fitness to lead. But today, the atmosphere shifted, because the main parties now have a common enemy.
Putin has invaded a sovereign European nation. It does have my support, and if it's used, we will support it.
But Labour want Boris Johnson to go further with sanctions and military support, which is why the Prime Minister preempted some of that with this.
The UK will shortly be providing a further package of military support to Ukraine.
Now, Sir Keir's advisers say they chose to ask questions on sanctions because they know many backbench Tory MPs want tougher action. The Labour leader is also keen to show his party is strong on defence and security in contrast with criticisms of his predecessor, Jeremy Corbyn. And to prove that very point, I spotted the Defence Secretary, Ben Wallace, and his Labour shadow, John Healey, standing side by side next to the Speaker's chair and leaving the chamber together. And there were moments when Boris Johnson praised the man who spent weeks attacking him.
And I'm grateful, by the way, for the general support that the opposition have given. And, Mr. Speaker, I'm genuinely grateful for the tone of his last question.
But a small group of left-wing Labour MPs are critical of NATO, and what they argue is the organisation's eastward expansion. Boris Johnson made sure to exploit that split.
Something that would be strong, Mr. Speaker, would be to take the whip away from the 14 members of the Labour Party who say that the aggressor in Ukraine is NATO. That would be a strong thing to do.
Well, our analysis of Keir Starmer's language today shows one of the words he used most was support, which you can see right here. That in itself is pretty rare. But the Labour leader was not completely supportive and questioned the Conservative Party's record of receiving donations from individuals with links to Russia.
The flood of foreign money drowning our politics. We can all now see how serious this is.
The largest single corporate donation to the Labour Party came from a member of the Chinese Communist Party.
At this moment, as the House agreed yesterday, we have to stand united. And I'm not going to be deflected from that.
Sky News analysis of Boris Johnson's language today shows his change in tone. In particular, the PM, as you can see here, stressed how grateful he was for opposition support. The word together also coming up, political parties working together, as well as Western nations. And in another old PMQ's trick, Mr Johnson had clearly been anticipating questions about the UK broadcasting licence of the Kremlin-backed TV channel RT, formerly Russia Today, and so was primed to say this.
My right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Culture, Media and Sport, has already asked Ofcom to review that matter.
And as soon as the SNP's Westminster leader, Ian Blackford, stood up, there were shouts and jeers from the Tory benches, including from the Culture Secretary, Nadine Dorries, who had earlier been sharing a pack of polos with fellow heckler Michael Gove. The reason for that heckle, Alex Salmond, Scotland's First Minister for 7 years and the SNP's leader for 20, who has now left the party and presents a show on the controversial TV channel.
Join me every Thursday on the Alex Salmond Show.
Coming from somebody whose very own Alex Salmond is a leading presenter on, as far as I know, on Russia Today.
Well, whatever happens next in Ukraine, defence and security are sure to feature more regularly at PMQs. In the coming days, expect further pressure on both the Conservatives and Labour parties about questionable political donations and on the government as calls for tougher action on Russia get louder.
Joe Pike there, and if you scan the QR code on your screen right now, you can listen to the latest edition of the Sky News Daily podcast. Today, Kate McCann takes a look at what exactly we know about Russian President Vladimir Putin and what he wants from Ukraine. You can subscribe to the Daily now, wherever you get your podcasts. Let's have a look now at some of the day's other main stories. And a 35-year-old man has been given a 5-year restraining order after he was found guilty of stalking the tennis star Emma Raducanu. The court heard that Amrit Magar once walked 23 miles to the 19-year-old's home in a series of 3 visits to the property. On one occasion, he stole her father's shoe from the family's porch as a souvenir. People living alongside stretches of the River Severn have been warned to prepare as a flooding and river levels peak. In Bewdley in Worcestershire, fire and rescue crews were out checking properties and speaking to residents after flood defences were breached following heavy rainfall on Tuesday. In Ironbridge in Shropshire, river levels are falling, but a severe flood warning remains in place amid fears the barriers could break. This is the News Hour at 5, live from the Ukrainian capital, Kiev. Coming up, we'll bring you the latest sport as one of the biggest names in tennis apologises for this outburst at the Mexican Open.
The effect of humans' abuse of the planet is clear to everyone.
This is meant to be the rainy season.
All you can see is farmland in the middle of the Amazon.
What you want as a journalist is to make them watch.
The tipping point is past, it's gone.
Climate change is not happening 10 years down the line, it's happening now. It's just whether they're going to actually act on it now.
Kingdom.
These last few years have seen some huge stories. And these stories have been driven by politics, by politicians, the people in power.
You must stay at home.
And it's my job to figure out how these decisions made by politicians impact all of us in our everyday lives.
This is the worst thing I've ever been through in my life.
People turn up here with their child stuff in a black sack and just say, I don't want to.
And that is what it is. It's first-class poverty.
Is this an example of the welfare state failing?
We take you to the heart of the stories that shape our world.
These are stories that affect us all. Millions of children are now having to catch up. Some stories have changed all of our lives. Because like the residents, the staff are being infected. Politicians, they make decisions all of the time, and it's our job to hold them to account. I wonder if you will take this opportunity to apologise to those families. But in the end, the real power doesn't actually lie with the politicians. The real power lies with the people. I'm Nick Martin. I'm the People and Politics correspondent at Sky News.
I love my job because I get to do something that is contributing to a better future.
Hello, welcome back. You're watching the News Hour on Sky News. Let's get to a sports update now with David.
Your home, your playground. Live life with Vitality and Zwift, the app that makes indoor cycling fun. This sports bulletin is brought to you by Vitality and Zwift.
I'll never get over not having skiing. I think I'll always miss the adrenaline, you know, the challenge, especially when there's Olympics or World Championships. You know, those big high pressure moments are what I really love. Skiing down a mountain at 85 miles an hour, I think I'll always miss that. But I just transferred now my goal setting and, you know, what challenges I have. I've just changed that into business, and I've tried to find, you know, new ways to motivate myself. And so those challenges are still there. It's just not the same. You know, it's not as much fun to be on a computer as it is to be skiing down a mountain.
Yeah, I hear that. You make it sound like it's been quite straightforward, but by 12, your parents were moving your whole family so that you could be somewhere to pursue your dream. People look at it and go, wow, and then you get there and you become this decorated skier. But behind all of that was a very different story that you explore in this book, wasn't there?
Yeah, it was definitely a lot going on that I didn't talk about or didn't feel comfortable talking about. I mean, I had depression for, almost 10 years before I even spoke about it to family members. So there was definitely a lot going on. And I think too, skiing was my way to escape everything. So in a lot of ways, I didn't want to talk about it because I just wanted to, kind of compartmentalize everything, I think, as most people want to do. But as I found out, it's not the greatest long-term strategy because eventually you have to, face your demons. But, it was a long journey, and I really wanted to tell my story, not just in the hopes of really inspiring others to overcome their own adversities. I've been through a lot, everyone's been through a lot.
Live life with Vitality and Zwift, the app that makes indoor cycling fun.
Let's take a look at the weather right now.
Look forward to brighter skies. The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
But a northwesterly airflow will make it much colder tomorrow, and this will bring heavy wintry showers to northern and western parts, some of them thundery. Before then, a windy evening with coastal gales in the north and west. Southeastern Britain will be mostly fine, but there'll be prolonged rain for central parts and wintry showers in the northwest. Rain over central Britain will clear into the mild southeast overnight, with much colder air and wintry showers taking over elsewhere. Heavy snow and frequent lightning can be expected in parts of the north, with drifting in the stiff wind and blizzard conditions at times. Southern Britain will see early rain clearing southeast tomorrow morning. Most parts can then expect sunshine and a scattering of blustery, wintry showers, with these showers concentrated in the northwest. It will be much colder for most, with a raw wind and further gales near western coasts. Ireland and Northern Ireland will see more frequent showers or longer spells of rain and hill snow spreading from the northwest during the afternoon. There will be little change elsewhere.
The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
This is the News Hour, live from the Ukrainian capital, Kiev. Coming up, as Ukraine calls on the United Nations to take further action against Russia, I'll be speaking to the former Deputy Secretary General of the UN, Lord Malloch Brown.
ba ma dalee commencé liggéey bi yokkute bu bari am nañ ko ci.
Welcome back to Kiev, the capital of a country soon to be living under a nationwide state of emergency. Ukraine is expected to introduce new emergency measures from midnight tonight, including the conscription of men of fighting age. Meanwhile, Ukraine's foreign minister has told the United Nations that every hour of inaction is a threat to the people here. Diplomats were meeting at the UN General Assembly in New York to discuss Russia's decision to send troops into 2 eastern regions of Ukraine. We're joined now from New York by Lord Malloch Brown. He's a former Foreign Office Minister and also Deputy Secretary General of the UN. And Mark, thank you for being with us. Some very powerful speeches at the UN General Assembly today, but from what Russia was saying, they didn't seem in the mood for any sort of compromise on this.
I suspect not at this stage, but you know, it is actually, many of us have been rather disappointed that the UN seemed rather on the sidelines of this crisis, and inevitably so, given that Russia is a permanent member of the Security Council, it seemed. But actually, 2 really interesting things have happened. First, in the Security Council, Kenya and Ghana, two African members, you know, condemned Russian behavior as sort of colonialism redux, as, you know, just a throwback to the past. And now, very unusually, a General Assembly debate, which you're seeing a kind of mobilization of a wide range of countries to condemn what, you know, is such a apparently 20th century travesty of one country invading its neighbor, and even worse, of an authoritarian regime seeking to overthrow a democratic neighbor. And in that sense, you know, while Russia may not need to fear, you know, a particularly strong resolution in the Security Council, or even necessarily a resolution itself in the General Assembly, what the UN has strangely done is marshal global public opinion so that this is no longer Europe and America versus Russia, it's Russia versus the rest. And obviously there are some notable exceptions such as China, but I think what Putin will see is that he's so breached basic international law, rule of law on this, that he's provoked a kind of coalition of condemnation from a much wider range of countries than he might have anticipated.
Well, the question then is, you know, well, A, was he listening? Would he take any notice? And B, would that kind of global outrage make any difference at all to what he seems to want to do?
Whether it makes an immediate difference, we'll see. But I think it may have the prospect of redrawing and reframing this conflict in a very different way, because until now it's been the US and Europe versus Russia, basically, with China, you know, holding the Russians' coat for them. But this, as I say, has the potential at least to reframe it around a world increasingly alarmed at the threat to democracy. So it suddenly becomes the Democrats versus Russia and its authoritarian allies. And, you know, even then there'll be some authoritarian allies who, because they're in the same neighborhood as the Russians, will, you know, actually come over onto the West side. So I think, you know, Putin, who'd hoped he could keep this a sort of regional squabble between himself and Europe and America, you know, suddenly faces the prospect that he could have seriously jeopardized Russia's global standing. And this is a Russia which isn't just trying to come back in Ukraine, but which has been sending mercenaries to Africa, starting to reopen embassies in Latin America. You know, he has aspirations to be a global figure again. And, you know, he may have set that back by what he's doing in Ukraine. And I think that may give him pause for thought, but more particularly, I think it may give pause to thought for many of his allies inside Russia. He threatens making Russia an international pariah. Now,
your experience in these things, do you see any room maybe after the reframing of this, as you say, in the UN General Assembly today, do you see any room at all where this can be, where the bloodshed can be avoided and some sort of negotiated answer to this, maybe even in the short term, can take place?
Well, you know, Putin is still playing a cat and mouse game, and you know, Donbass is different to the rest of Ukraine in the sense that, you know, the question is, does he go further? Because you know, in Donbass, the violence and risk to life will be there, and it's quite likely that he'll go after Ukrainian leaderships that have resisted these Russian-led autonomous governments there. But you know, where the bloodshed really comes is if he goes the whole way and launches an attack on Kiev. And I think when I say cat and mouse, you know, it's still unclear whether he's going to do the latter. The movement of embassies, including now the movement of the Russian embassy out of Kiev, suggests he sadly probably will, but it's not yet definitive that he will. So he does still have some space to turn a pause at first into a long-term Donbass, but not further. I think the difficulty for him is even Donbass is enough to secure major international opposition, because he's got no right going into a neighbor and carving a piece out of it. And I think, you know, so many in the West recognize that the response to his taking Crimea in 2014 was just much too weak and limp-wristed, and this time it's got to be tougher. So, you know, I think we're in for a period of confrontation on both sides, and you know, we'll see whether he has the power to pull back or not. And I think probably the other point just to say is that, you know, the West has got to show sustained mettle. It can't say, well, it was just Donbass, so we stop at lesser sanctions. And, you know, I think the sanctions also have to be very, very smart sanctions. You know, in the case of the UK, they've got to come down much harder, you know, on illicit Russian wealth in London. It's time to really take on this issue, to pass the economic crimes bill that the Conservative government has been promising since 2016. Because otherwise, you know, you look at a country like the UK, it's willing to send some defensive weapons to Ukraine and put a few more troops in Lithuania or Poland. But, you know, it's not going after those around Putin who've taken advantage of the ease of moving money to London. So every country needs to really step up and do its maximum show seriousness.
Yeah, interesting stuff. Lord Mallet-Brown, thank you very much indeed for being with us. Appreciate your time.
Thank you.
This is the News Hour, live from the Ukrainian capital, Kiev. Coming up, do Boris Johnson's financial sanctions on Russian oligarchs and banks go far enough? We'll be getting the thoughts of the Shadow Trade Secretary, Nick Thomas-Simmons.
Well, it's a unique piece, and basically it was a bit of a surprise for my 21st birthday. My dad bought me this notebook for the simple reason I was in Hollyoaks at the time, and I played the character Jude Cunningham. And my dad was at home in Wigan, and I was on a night shoot in Liverpool. And for some reason, he ended up on the phone to Sotheby's, and I think he was 2 bottles of wine in when he started bidding against an American. And he thought, I'll be damned if that goes to the USA, it's got to stay in Liverpool. And he ended up winning the bid and called me up when I was on set to say, guess what, you own the Hey Jude lyrics. And I'm like, what? That's a bit overwhelming for a 20-year-old. But after 20 odd years, we've decided to put it on public display at the Beatles Museum here in Liverpool, and it's their 30th anniversary. And I thought, you know what, it can't be under lock and key anymore. It can't, you know, these people really need to see it. The fans need to get back into Liverpool and understand this like amazing piece of rock and roll memorabilia. I've never touched it. You've got to wear white gloves and everything. It's completely secure. It's like, I mean, it's priceless, really. So no, I am too clumsy to touch it. I've obviously seen it, but the guys at the museum said, do you want to hold it? I'm like, no, don't give it to me. I'll break it. It's kind of like it's a family heirloom, I guess. I've got 4 boys, the Fab Four, and number 4 is actually called Jude. But I mean, I don't think we'll ever sell it. You know, to be honest, my dad bought it for him. He just used it as an excuse to buy it for me, let's face it. But no, hopefully it'll stay in the family. But I just wanted to make sure that everybody in the world could benefit from it and understand it, and obviously support playing at Glastonbury this year, so that, I mean, loads more fans will start coming in and next generation will appreciate the brilliance that was the Beatles. I don't know any wedding, funeral, black tie-do that does not play Hey Jude. Everyone stands up and everyone sings to it. It's like a universal anthem. And I think one of my sons said to me yesterday, he says, it's a really famous song, Mummy. And I said, I think Hey Jude and Happy Birthday are the world's most famous songs, yeah.
A lot of action going on. I'm Alex Crawford and I'm Sky's special correspondent based in Istanbul.
This is what makes the job so fantastic.
I love my job because I get to do something that is contributing to a better future.
Welcome back. The UK promised to hit Russia with powerful sanctions over its military confrontation with Ukraine, but the measures announced by Prime Minister Boris Johnson has disappointed allies and critics alike, with some warning that the limited sanctions could be sending a wrong message to Vladimir Putin. In a moment, we'll be speaking to Nick Thomas Simmons, but just before we do that, I want to show you some pictures that we're getting in from Berlin, and it is the Brandenburg Gate, and it is lit up in the colours of the country I am in now, Ukraine. And we've been hearing all afternoon Western countries supporting Ukraine at the General Assembly, condemning the actions of Russia, and the Brandenburg Gate is lit up in the flag of this country. And the Germans have also moved, one has to say, on sanctions with halting the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which could well impact what President Putin does. But there we are, pictures there from Berlin. And as I say, joining me now is the Shadow Secretary of State for International Trade, Nick Thomas Simmons. Thank you very much indeed for being with us. Who and what would you be sanctioning that the government is not?
The government in standing up, firstly, to clear Russian aggression, but also in defence of the sovereignty of Ukraine. What we are also saying to the government is they should be doing more on sanctions. If they do more, we will support it. And there are a number of additional things the government could be doing. More on restricting access of the Russian government to international finance, for example, but also cracking down on that laundromat of dirty money that we are seeing washing through London. We really need to be putting those measures in place now to deal with that. And also, by the way, dealing with Russian disinformation. We shouldn't have Russia TV broadcasting in this country anymore.
Right, I was going to talk to you about that. You would want to see RT, Russia Today, closed down effectively in this country, would you?
We need to see its broadcasting license taken away. We've been calling for that. We've seen the Prime Minister, it seemed announced at Prime Minister's questions today that a letter had been sent from the Secretary of State for Culture, Media and Sport for Ofcom to look at this. We called for that some time ago. Russian disinformation is a huge issue. The Russian threat, cyber threat, is very real too. I stood up in the House of Commons, Mark, back in July 2020 when the Russia report was published that was making recommendations about these issues. That report and its recommendations have not been implemented. Now is the time to implement that report, and if the Prime Minister were to do so, he would receive the support of the opposition.
Isn't the problem that there's a free speech issue here? I mean, isn't banning broadcasters precisely what Russia does?
Well, no, because there is a difference between a broadcaster that follows a set of rules, that isn't breaching the broadcasting code in the way that Russia today has done time and time again, and a station that is broadcasting misinformation. There is no comparison between a broadcaster following the rules and the position of Russia today. So that is something that does need to be urgently looked at, but it is one measure among many others that is required to tackle the Russian campaign of disinformation, of threats to our cyber security that is very real. The government should already have acted on it. If they do now, they will have our support.
Isn't there a practical problem here that I mean, I don't know how many people watch Russia Today in the UK. I don't think it's that many. So, I mean, if you do ban it, then the Russians are just going to turn round, as the Russians always do, in a tit-for-tat thing, and they'll probably, you know, kick out BBC correspondents and, you know, close down the BBC in Russia or something, which we don't, clearly, at this precise moment, we do not want to happen.
But there is no equivalence between the BBC, which follows a set of rules, as indeed does Sky News. These are broadcasters that are actually not on a regular basis actually sending out misinformation. And the point about Russia Today is about RT is to actually make that point very, very clearly to President Putin, that we are acting robustly. We are more than aware of the Russian campaign of disinformation, the tactics that the Kremlin regularly employs, and we are willing to do something practical, strong and robust to send a very clear message to this Russian regime that we will not put up with it.
Just 20 seconds left. I mean, would President Putin be bothered if you close down RT, and shouldn't he be concentrating on hurting President Putin?
We should be doing it as part of a range of things. As I've indicated, we need to crack down on that laundromat of dirty money as well to really get that message to Vladimir Putin's inner circle. It's one of a number of measures we should be doing urgently.
OK, got to go. Thank you very much indeed. This is the News Hour, live from the Ukrainian capital, Kiev. Coming up, Ukraine is poised to declare a state of emergency in the face of what it calls Russian aggression.
ba ma dalee commencé liggéey bi yokkute bu bari am nañ ko ci.
You're watching the News Hour at 6, live from the Ukrainian capital, Kiev. I'm Mark Austin, coming up in the next 60 minutes. Ukraine prepares to impose a state of emergency in the face of what it calls growing Russian aggression. President Putin accuses the West of ignoring Russia's legitimate security concerns. But Moscow faces condemnation as the UN General Assembly meets to discuss the crisis. Meanwhile, the UK asks watchdogs to monitor the Kremlin-backed TV channel RT. Also tonight, a man who walked 23 miles to Emma Raducanu's home is given a restraining order for stalking. And a threat to life remains along the River Severn with 2 severe flood warnings in place. Good evening from Kiev, the capital of a country soon to be living under a nationwide state of emergency. Ukraine is expected to introduce new measures from midnight, including the conscription of men of fighting age. Ukraine's leaders say it comes in the face of escalating Russian aggression. Earlier, Ukrainian government websites and those of the country's banks were targeted in a cyber attack. Tonight we're live with our correspondents in Kiev, in Washington and in Westminster on another fast-paced day of developments. Well, Russia appears to be deploying more troops and material along Ukraine's border in western Russia and Belarus, according to satellite imagery from the US firm Maxar. Boris Johnson has announced that the UK will be providing more military assistance to Ukraine. The Prime Minister also says that the broadcasting regulator Ofcom has been asked to review the output of the Kremlin-backed TV channel RT. Meanwhile, the UN General Assembly has convened in New York to discuss the situation in Ukraine. Well, we'll have more on all that in a moment, but first let's examine what's happening here on the ground in Ukraine. The country's state of emergency is expected to include bans on mass gatherings and union strikes. Regional authorities will be able to apply measures including additional protection for public facilities, restrictions on traffic and more transport and document checks. The Ukrainian president insisted the measures were necessary as he called out Russia's latest movements in the east of this country.
The military presence of the Russian Federation on the occupied territory of Donbass has been hiding behind separatist uniform, and now we see that this is a unilateral departure from Minsk agreement. And this is an undermining of Ukrainian and international attempts to regulate the situation on the Ukrainian Donbass.
Well, these are the areas of Ukraine Mr. Zelensky is talking about. Much of Donetsk and Luhansk are controlled by Russian-backed separatists. They make up the Donbass region. The United States says Russian troops are moving into those areas following President Putin's decision to formally recognize their independence. Meanwhile, these satellite images from the US firm Maxar appear to show that Russia has been sending more troops to Ukraine's eastern border. This shows equipment near Belgorod, around 10 miles from Ukraine. The deployment includes a field hospital, and more than 100 Russian military vehicles have been photographed in Belarus near Ukraine's northern border. 3 days after military exercises were supposed to have finished. President Putin has today accused the West of ignoring Russia's legitimate security demands. He said he was still open to diplomacy, but that he would put Russian national security interests first. The Russian leader was seen today laying a wreath at the tomb of the unknown soldier to mark Defender of the Fatherland Day, the Russian army's main holiday. In a statement released to coincide with the public holiday, Mr. Putin said Russia would continue to bolster its military in the face of what he called a difficult international situation.
Our country stays open for direct and honest dialogue, for the search of diplomatic solutions for the most complex issues. But I will repeat, Russia's interests, our citizens' safety, are absolute. So we will continue strengthening and developing our army and navy, increasing their efficiency, providing them with the most advanced equipment.
Our security and defence editor, Deborah Haynes, who is also here in Kiev, has the latest.
It's interesting, isn't it, to see the government now really acting as though it is a government under serious military threat. For the last couple of months, from the president downwards, they've been really kind of playing down the warnings from Western allies about the potential for a full-scale invasion. The Ukrainian president really sort of telling people previously not to panic. But tonight, the parliament is due to be voting on this state of emergency legislation, which would impose curbs on people's movements, travel movements, and potentially other sorts of restrictions such as curfews. We haven't got the full details yet, but it is a sign of a government that's preparing for potentially worse to come. It's already had to deal with the fact that Russia has sent or ordered troops to go into the east of the country, those Donetsk and Luhansk regions that have been in a frozen conflict for 8 years, but with such a scale of force around its borders, and warnings again from Western allies, including, for example, the British Foreign Secretary, who today said she believes an attack on Kiev to be highly likely. They clearly aren't ignoring or openly, publicly ignoring them anymore. They are making it very clear that their people, the public, need to prepare. Again, it's no sense of panic. I was out in the streets today. We were just doing some gathering and speaking to people, and there's no sense that it's very calm. There's people are going about their usual business, but everybody is very mindful of the threat and the potential for this to escalate, and the fact that you've now got reservists being called up. It's not a mass mobilisation, but it's an interesting shift and a sign that this is a country that's preparing to have to deal with the horrors that could come.
Deborah Haynes there. Well, EU leaders are to hold an emergency summit tomorrow, and in New York, the United Nations General Assembly has been discussing the crisis here in Ukraine. The UN Secretary-General gave a stark warning of what might happen in the event of a wider Russian invasion of Ukrainian territory.
As we sadly know all too well, in conflict, civilians, including women and children, always suffer first and suffer most. If the conflict in Ukraine expands, the world could see a scale and severity of need unseen for many years. I urge all sides to allow safe and unimpeded access by humanitarian agencies, including in non-government controlled areas of eastern Ukraine.
Let's go live to Washington and our US correspondent Mark Stone. And Mark, the General Assembly today was a platform for some very powerful speeches, but when you listen to the Russian speech, not a lot of room for optimism.
Lots of words, but where's the diplomacy? Where is the action? We don't yet know. Let me bring you some breaking news, though, first of all, that we have just received from a senior defense official speaking here in the United States at the Pentagon over the river in Virginia, who has given an update of an American assessment of how ready the Russian forces are for what they believe is an invasion that is about to happen. So this is attributable to a US defense official who says that Russia is, quote, as ready as they can be. They have about 80% of their troops in forward operating positions ready to go, ranging from between 5 kilometers from the border to 50 kilometers from the border. This is another quote. They are literally ready to go now. They've brought in nearly 100% of the forces we anticipated Putin would need for a large-scale invasion. Russia has more than 10 landing ships in the Black Sea, all of which have hundreds of troops on board. And they believe that it is the assessment of the US military that Putin has everything ready for a large-scale invasion. And it's the view now of the US administration, as indeed it has been for a few days now, that a large-scale invasion is Vladimir Putin's ultimate goal. So pretty ominous language there from the US Department of Defense. We're expecting a news conference from the Pentagon in around about 2 hours' time, where we may get some more detail on that assessment. I guess it is, well, I can tell you it is definitely worth stressing that we are in the middle of an information war here, and we are part of that information war. So we can't necessarily, we must attribute what I've just said there to Department of Defense officials, and we can't independently say whether or not it's true, but certainly you can judge for your own eyes the number of Russian soldiers that continue to be massed on the border. Now, that is the facts on the ground as they are. The words in the United Nations, as you say, have been very, very powerful indeed. You heard from the Secretary-General a few moments ago, and I think we can hear now from the United States ambassador to the United Nations, followed by the Ukrainian foreign minister, who has travelled here to make some powerful arguments in the chamber of the UN.
We're not going back to an era of empires and colonies, or to the USSR or the Soviet Union. We have moved forward, And we must ensure, as the permanent representative from Kenya said in the Security Council on Monday night, that the embers of dead empires do not ignite new forms of oppression and violence.
I warn every nation in this distinguished chamber. No one will be able to sit out this crisis if President Putin decides that he can move forward with his aggression against Ukraine. If Russia does not get a severe, swift, and decisive response now, this will mean a total bankruptcy of the international security system and international institutions which are tasked with maintaining the global security order. Ukraine will not hesitate to exercise its inherent right of self-defense as outlined in Article 51 of the Charter of the United Nations in response to the armed attacks of the Russian Federation.
Now, in terms of Russia's next move, clearly there is a concern that they will respond to the sanctions that have already been imposed on it. Cyber attacks here in the United States and around Europe are something that the Americans are certainly preparing for. But in terms of on-the-ground responses, what Russia might do next, I think this map is quite instructive in that it shows the areas where the Russians, where Vladimir Putin has declared independent states, that area that is shaded there, that is the area which is already separatist, but the wider area in yellow is potentially, if Vladimir Putin is to be taken at his word, the areas that he has declared to be independent states. Now, if he decides that by declaring them independent states, he is going to put his so-called peacekeepers into that whole area, rather than just into the bit that is shaded in the black there, then that would amount to war, effectively, because he would be coming head-to-head with Ukrainian soldiers in the yellow area there. And so, I mean, that would really be a very, very serious situation indeed. This area, this whole area here to the east of where you are, Mark, is where at the Pentagon they are watching very, very closely for what President Putin might do next.
Yeah, it is all looking rather bleak. Mark, thank you very much indeed. Well, Boris Johnson says more British weapons are being sent to Ukraine over fears of a full-scale invasion by Russia. The Prime Minister told the House of Commons that the UK has already provided anti-tank capabilities and will now offer further defensive options.
In light of the increasingly threatening behaviour from Russia and in line with our previous support, the UK will shortly be providing a further package of military support to Ukraine. Yeah. This will include lethal aid in the form of defensive weapons and non-lethal aid. I don't think people quite realise that the UK is out in front. We've sanctioned 275 individuals already. Yesterday we announced measures that place banks worth £37 billion, worth £37 billion under sanctions, in addition to more oligarchs. And, Mr. Speaker, there is more to come.
Well, the Labour leader, Sir Keir Starmer, questioned the government's past record in accepting donations from wealthy Russians.
Putin has invaded a sovereign European nation. He is attacked because he fears openness and democracy, and because he knows that, given a choice, people will not choose to live under erratic, violent rule. He seeks division. We must stay united. He hopes for inaction. So we must take a stand. He believes that we're too corrupted to do the right thing. Yeah. So we must prove him wrong. And I believe that we can. So will the Prime Minister work across the House to ensure that this is the end of the era of oligarch impunity, by saying that this House and this country will no longer be homes for their loot?
Let's go live to Westminster and our chief political correspondent, John Craig. And John, clearly, from what we were hearing there, the pressure still very much on Boris Johnson to do more on sanctions.
Stronger sanctions, also a crackdown on so-called dirty money in London, and also from Sir Keir Starmer yesterday and today, a demand to revoke the licence of Russia Today, the Russia TV station that Alex Salmond and other politicians have appeared on. Mr Johnson made reference to the former Scottish First Minister. Now, Mr Johnson rather flat-footed Sir Keir Starmer by announcing that Nadine Dorries had already written this letter to the boss of Ofcom, that's Dame Melanie Dawes, calling her on for her to review the licence of Russia Today. Well, Nadine Dorries didn't get a particularly helpful reply, because in her reply, the Ofcom boss has basically said, I'm confident we've got the full range of tools to deal with this, full range of enforcement tools at our disposal. Our track record shows when we find a breach, we can take action, and we do. So a bit of a rebuff for the Culture Secretary, Nadine Dorries, there. But those calls on tougher sanctions, on dirty money, and indeed Russia Today will no doubt continue. But the big pressure on the PM, obviously, is on calls for tougher sanctions.
Right, and the Defence Secretary using some interesting language regarding President Putin.
Well, after the rather measured language of Sir Keir Starmer that we just heard, Ben Wallace, the Defence Secretary, along with Priti Patel, was visiting some soldiers to announce the government scrapping visa fees for long-serving overseas military personnel. And listen to this rather colourful language he used about President Putin, and look at Priti Patel's reaction too.
Whether you're based in Cyprus, or we do longer tours in Kenya or Oman, or are busy, we're just making it a brigade at the moment up in Estonia. It's going to be a busy army. And unfortunately, we've got some busy adversaries now. Putin gone full Tonto, I think it's something. And that is going to require. We've got 1,000 people on standby. If you're on standby, no. I think we should send the Gurkhas.
Yeah, no.
So the Scots Guards kicked the backside of Tsar Nicholas I in 1853 in Crimea. We can always do it again. We can always do it again. Well, Tsar Nicholas I made the same mistake Putin did.
So, gone full Tonto, first of all, and then he talked about how the Scots Guards kicked the backside of Tsar Nicholas I in 1853. We can always do it again. Tsar Nicholas made the same mistake Putin did. Laughter from the army officers there, but a rather startled look on the face of Priti Patel. The dictionary definition of gone toto is listed as stupid, crazy, dumb, lost your mind, lost the plot. Clearly, Mr. Wallace wanted to get that message across. Was he sure? Did he realise he was being recorded there? Well, he's normally a pretty safe pair of hands as Defence Secretary. Some will say it was a gaffe, but I suspect that he knew exactly what he was doing, and that was the message he wanted to get across.
Yeah, OK. John, thank you very much. Time now for a quick look at some of the day's other main stories. And a 35-year-old man has been given a 5-year restraining order after he was found guilty of stalking the tennis star Emma Raducanu. The court heard how Amrit Magar once walked 23 miles to the 19-year-old's home in a series of 3 visits to the property. On one occasion, he stole her father's shoe from the family's porch as a souvenir. People living alongside stretches of the River Severn have been warned to prepare as river levels peak. In Bewdley, in Worcestershire, fire and rescue crews were out checking properties and speaking to residents after flood defences were breached following heavy rainfall on Tuesday. In Ironbridge, in Shropshire, river levels are falling, but a severe flood warning remains in place amid fears the barriers could break. Well, as we were hearing earlier, Boris Johnson announced more military support for Ukraine at Prime Minister's questions today. It was a response, perhaps, to criticism that the sanctions against Russia he announced yesterday do not go far enough. There was, however, a rare mood of unity in the Commons, as Joe Pike explains in PMQ's Unwrapped.
The very design of the House of Commons chamber is adversarial, and we have had weeks of angry confrontations over the PM's behaviour, his character and his fitness to lead. But today, the atmosphere shifted because the main parties now have a common enemy.
Putin has invaded a sovereign European nation. It does have my support, and if it's used, we will support it.
But Labour want Boris Johnson to go further with sanctions and military support, which is why the Prime Minister preempted some of that with this.
The UK will shortly be providing a further package of military support to Ukraine.
Now, Sir Keir's advisers say they chose to ask questions on sanctions because they know many backbench Tory MPs want tougher action. The Labour leader is also keen to show his party is strong on defence and security, in contrast with criticisms of his predecessor, Jeremy Corbyn. And to prove that very point, I spotted the Defence Secretary, Ben Wallace, and his Labour shadow, John Healey, standing side by side next to the Speaker's chair and leaving the chamber together. And there were moments when Boris Johnson praised the man who spent weeks attacking him.
And I'm grateful, by the way, for the general support that the opposition have given. And, Mr. Speaker, I'm genuinely grateful for the tone of his last question.
But a small group of left-wing Labour MPs are critical of NATO, and what they argue is the organisation's eastward expansion. Boris Johnson made sure to exploit that split.
Something that would be strong, Mr. Speaker, would be to take the whip away from the 14 members of the Labour Party who say that the aggressor in Ukraine is NATO. That would be a strong thing to do.
Well, our analysis of Keir Starmer's language today shows one of the words he used most was support, which you can see right here. That in itself is pretty rare. But the Labour leader was not completely supportive and questioned the Conservative Party's record of receiving donations from individuals with links to Russia.
The flood of foreign money drowning our politics. We can all now see how serious this is.
The largest single corporate donation to the Labour Party came from a member of the Chinese Communist Party.
At this moment, as the House agreed yesterday, we have to stand united. And I am not going to be deflected from that.
Sky News analysis of Boris Johnson's language today shows his change in tone. In particular, the PM, as you can see here, stressed how grateful he was for opposition support. The word together also coming up, political parties working together, as well as Western nations. And in another old PMQ's trick, Mr Johnson had clearly been anticipating questions about the UK broadcasting licence of the Kremlin-backed TV channel RT, formerly Russia Today, and so was primed to say this.
My right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Culture, Media and Sport, has already asked Ofcom to review that matter.
And as soon as the SNP's Westminster leader, Ian Blackford, stood up, there were shouts and jeers from the Tory benches, including from the Culture Secretary, Nadine Dorries, who had earlier been sharing a pack of polos with fellow heckler Michael Gove. The reason for that heckle, Alex Salmond, Scotland's First Minister for 7 years and the SNP's leader for 20, who has now left the party and presents a show on the controversial TV channel.
Join me every Thursday on the Alex Salmond Show.
Coming from somebody whose very own Alex Salmond is a leading presenter on, as far as I know, on Russia Today.
Well, whatever happens next in Ukraine, defence and security are sure to feature more regularly at PMQs. In the coming days, expect further pressure on both the Conservatives and Labour parties about questionable political donations and on the government as calls for tougher action on Russia get louder.
Joe Pike there. This is the News Hour at 6, live from the Ukrainian capital, Kiev. Coming up, we'll bring you the latest sport as one of the biggest names in tennis apologises for this outburst at the Mexican Open.
It's definitely something we're never going to forget. Just being out there
representing Jamaica, representing ourselves, and just representing everybody that was behind us, really. So that was fantastic.
People are just happy that we were there at the Olympic. Even one of the German that came second in the 4-man and 2-man, he walked up to us and said, I am so happy that Jamaica is here. You guys, Jamaica is here and bobsled is here.
It's still a difficult time for us. Usually there's a test event in October, which we didn't end up going to. So even before we started racing, we had, in the 2-man, we had 10 runs to learn the track before we raced. So equivalent of, say, 10 minutes of practice before we raced the 2-man. And then the 4-man, we pretty much had 6 runs, so 6 minutes of training before we raced the 4-man. So it was still an extremely difficult time, but we never shied away from the challenge. We literally went in head first and gave it 100% every single time we went down the track. So on the track, I would probably say corner 13 is quite a little tricky corner for a lot of people, not only us, but with more time, we would have probably mastered it, but we just had to basically make do with the results we got out of that corner sometimes.
Yeah, I'm going to just take 1 month break and then back at training again. But the memory that I take back is when I stepped to the line with Sean Wayne in the 2-man, knowing that we did everything possible we could to make it to that point, and we are very proud of ourselves to go out there and represent our country.
I love my job because I get to do something that is contributing to a better future.
This is the News Hour at 6 on Sky News from Ukraine. Time now for the sport with David.
Chase the pack, achieve your goals, and unlock rewards. Live life with Vitality and Zwift, the app that makes indoor cycling fun. This sports bulletin is brought to you by Vitality and Zwift.
I'll never get over not having skiing. I think I'll always miss the adrenaline, the challenge, especially when there's Olympics or World Championships. Those big high pressure moments are what I really love. Skiing down a mountain at 85 miles an hour, I think I'll always miss that. But I just transferred now my goal setting and what challenges I have. I've just changed that into business, and I've tried to find new ways to motivate myself. And so those challenges are still there. It's just not the same. It's not as much fun to be on a computer as it is to be skiing down a mountain.
Yeah, I hear that. You make it sound like it's been quite straightforward, but by 12, your parents were moving your whole family so that you could be somewhere to pursue your dream. People look at it and go, wow, and then you get there and you become this decorated skier. But behind all of that was a very different story that you explore in this book, wasn't there?
Yeah, it was definitely a lot going on that I didn't talk about or didn't feel comfortable talking about. I mean, I was I had depression for, almost 10 years before I even spoke about it to family members. So there was definitely a lot going on. And I think too, skiing was my way to escape everything. So in a lot of ways, I didn't want to talk about it because I just wanted to, kind of compartmentalize everything, I think, as most people want to do. But as I found out, it's not the greatest long-term strategy because eventually you have to, face your demons. But, it was a long journey, and I really wanted to tell my story, not just in the hopes of really inspiring others to overcome their own adversities. I've been through a lot, everyone's been through a lot. Everyone has their own story, but I think we can all, keep pushing forward and just have to believe in yourself.
Live life with Vitality and Zwift, the app that makes indoor cycling fun.
This is the News Hour at 6, live from the Ukrainian capital, Kiev. Coming up, Ukraine prepares to impose a state of emergency. We'll find out what that means for the people living here.
ba ma dalee commencé liggéey bi yokkute bu bari am nañ ko ci.
Welcome back to Kiev, the capital of a country soon we're told, to be living under a nationwide state of emergency. Ukraine is expected to introduce new emergency measures from midnight, including the conscription of men of fighting age. Let's speak now to a Ukrainian MP and Deputy Head of the Committee on EU Integration, Maria Mezantseva. Thank you very much for being with us. I gather you're in Parliament now waiting to vote on these new measures. What will a state of emergency look like in Ukraine?
Thank you very much for having me live today on Sky News. Indeed, we are about to start already a second extraordinary plenary sitting with only one item on the agenda, which is the possible state of emergency, which to my mind will be passed with the vast majority. It has to be articulated very carefully to the Ukrainian population and abroad as well, because this is a very adequate measure of what has been already going in some regions of Ukraine, like for instance Kharkiv region where I'm coming from, which is which is very close to the border of Donetsk and Lugansk regions, parts of which were occupied by Russia back in 2014. And recently, as you all know, well, actually yesterday and the day before, there was a decision of the Russian parliament to grant a status of independence of the so-called republics which have been formed there, which is a very direct breach of the international law, international human law. That's why the state of emergency in Ukraine, which might be voted very shortly today, will function in this manner. The cars, vehicles which are crossing now the regions across Ukraine might be double checked, additionally checked for various items, various reasons which might look suspicious, or passports and ID cards. Of course, we have had it since 2014, let's say, when I was crossing a border with Donetsk and Lugansk regions at the controlled territory of Ukraine, I was supposed to be checked and show my ID and to say which purposes I'm traveling with. Therefore, it is not something outrageous. It is for the purpose also to strengthen the local authorities and local administrations. And if you remember, back in 2014, these were the targets of the separatist movements which were developing across the east and south of Ukraine. I remember very much as Kharkiv, which is the second largest city in the east of Ukraine, was the administration of the region was occupied for more than 20 days. Therefore, we are not afraid of doing so. The parliament agrees together with the president and the government that this is a necessary measure. It is not a martial law, and many people confuse it. Therefore, it's just a strength for security services and police.
Yeah, Maria, I was sorry to interrupt. We were in Kharkiv presenting the program a few days, and it is amazing how things sort of going on as normal, but these constant warnings that an attack is imminent, that it is coming tomorrow, it's coming on a certain date, that it's coming any day now, that must be incredibly stressful for the people here living under this constant threat.
As a representative of a constituency in Kharkiv, which is right in the heart of the city, I am receiving various calls and text messages from the voters and from the Kharkiv citizens asking whether they should relocate, whether they should relocate their children and elderly people of them as members of their families. I am not saying yes, because there are no such instructions also for the members of parliament who are representing such regions in the east and south, for instance. So we are, as you have said and you have rightly mentioned, even in Kharkiv, we keep calm, we carry on, We have voted today for strengthening our army financially, giving it more opportunities to develop professionally. And we thank to the UK government, UK Parliament for the recent law on sanctions and also actual military aid, which strengthen our army, not by words, but with actions. And this is where Ukrainian people have to sleep peacefully, because professionals have to do their work. And the army, Ukrainian army, became really professional within this 8 years of an armed conflict, as it's stipulated in the international law, and a war, a real war, which we call it. It is a challenging time for everyone, also for business. That's why, as a new initiative of President Zelensky, we're trying to push forward some initiatives for business in terms of easing in the taxation as well. I'm in favor of such proposals, because we will not be able to receive more taxes if the pressure on business might occur. Of course, it is more a psychological issue of what you're asking. How can we deal with the stress? And here we can say that definitely everyone have to do their job professionally, parliamentarians in the parliament, local authorities on the ground. We have passed a new law which was there for waiting for 10 years, actually 8 years during this armed conflict, for the local authorities to develop the territorial arming and defense, which is very important. So local people can join this brilliant initiative, and some of MPs did so as well.
And Maria, we only have a minute or so left, but I just wanted to ask, do you think with these new measures, Ukraine is prepared for the attack that may come?
Well, if we gather it all in let's say big box of the measures, not just the state of emergency, which is just stating of the state of the situation we've been living in for years. This aggression, which collided with the various tensions at the demarcation line. We are seeing the breach of ceasefire. Ukraine, regarding all that, keeps to its commitment of a ceasefire. We also are fighting with fake news, and that's very important. And you know how one fake news can influence the population, and it does. This is our job to do so with the Ministry of Information and Culture. But I am sure that we react accordingly, and the whole world is looking at Ukraine as a spot of democracy today.
Okay, well, Maria, thank you very much indeed. Maria Mezentseva there, who is in the Ukrainian parliament, waiting to vote on the emergency measures that we think will come in here at midnight. Thank you very much indeed. Right, this is the News Hour at 6, live from the Ukrainian capital, Kiev. Coming up, concerns that the situation in Ukraine could encourage Chinese ambitions for Taiwan.
It was everything that a journalist might want in a story.
A story that you'd be proud to have filmed.
But they didn't want journalists to see the real story.
It was very tiring, it was very sad, it was very scary at times.
Hey, there's no need for this.
But you have to keep going.
Look at that.
You don't want to lecture people, but you do have to give them the facts.
We should protect our heritage. Unfortunately, it will become part of Azerbaijan. This monastery is under the protection for now, the next 5 years at least, of Russian peacekeepers. I'm Diana Magny and I'm Sky's Russia correspondent, based here in Moscow. I witnessed the despair of the Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh who were digging up the soil of their dead relatives. It's Armenians who've abandoned these villages now. Quite what their strategy is, I'm not sure, but they have made some arrests already today.
They can't kill everyone, they can't shoot everyone, they can't arrest everybody.
We take you to the heart of the stories that shape our world. I mean, this clearly says, I love Hitler. Are you saying that doesn't say Hitler? Russia insists that its military build-up in the Arctic is purely defensive.
I love my job because I get to do something that is contributing to a better future.
Welcome back. Let's talk for a moment now about how the situation here in Ukraine is being keenly watched in Taiwan. Taiwanese officials are concerned that China may be emboldened by Russia's actions and the international response to them. China maintains that Taiwan is a breakaway Chinese province, but has today rejected comparisons between the situation here and its own ambitions. Let's bring in Lev Nachman, researcher at the Fairbanks Center for Chinese Studies at Harvard University. Thank you for being with us. I notice, in the light of what's happening here, that Taiwan's president has ordered security forces to step up surveillance and defenses. Are there parallels between what's happening here and Taiwan?
Yeah, so Ukraine and Taiwan, there are meaningful comparisons to be made between these two places. They're both contested democracies that are both constantly and coercively pushed into trying to be forced to join their kind of neighboring power that claims them as their own, Russia and China. But when it comes to comparing kind of the geopolitical tensions and the possibility of invasions, the similarities start to kind of disappear, because the way in which Russia is trying to coercively bring Ukraine back into its borders through invasion is going to be very different from how China would try to do so with Taiwan. Most importantly, when it comes to how the rest of the world responds to both of these scenarios is going to be very different. The United States' relationship with Taiwan is very different from the United States' relationship with Ukraine. And the responsibilities, the geopolitical strategies that the United States has in East Asia are very different from Europe. And same with how the EU's relationship with Taiwan is versus the EU's relationship is with Ukraine.
But I guess the similarities are that Taiwan and Ukraine are both existing in the shadow, if you like, of giant neighbors who want to control them. And also the two leaders, Putin and Xi Jinping, they both have this sort of nostalgia, don't they, for the glory days?
Yes, but Xi's attitude towards Taiwan has been much more measured and much more patient and I would dare say pragmatic than necessarily how Putin has been responding to Ukraine. a lot of global commentary has kind of noticed how Putin's decision to invade Ukraine seems to read as somewhat irrational and sporadic. And if you look at how Xi and China's response has been, it has not been to completely endorse and back Russia. Instead, Xi and the PRC has taken a much more pragmatic approach in terms of not condemning nor completely endorsing any actor right now. A lot of the messaging from the PRC is to say that it's largely the United States, of course, who is at fault. But you also see the PRC saying that they support peaceful, diplomatic,